Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders. It's Friday again, and welcome to episode 99 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. We're going to be approaching episode 100 next week. Today, we're going to be doing something slightly different. Rather than our usual format of this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics, I thought I'd mix it up a little bit for you. Today, we're going to be going through a speech that was delivered by Donald Trump at the United Nations meeting. And this was a really, really historical United Nations meeting. And what I want to do is pull out and translate everything into proof of weapons network language so that you can see the contrast between the politicians and what they say versus what is happening in reality by following the money. This is a kind of learning exercise to see if you've learned anything from the 99 episodes of Bitcoin Hard Talk and the 14, 15 years, even before Bitcoin, that we started this channel when we were giving interviews with a younger and better looking Simon Dixon, but less experienced, where I was interviewing those different types of people in the monetary reform community. Well, we have come a long way. And I really want you to, what we're gonna be doing in this episode anyway, we're gonna be playing the speech live, and then I'm gonna periodically stop and translate it into what it really means. Because this is the skill I want you to learn, that we follow the money every single week, and that gets us ahead of the lies that they're telling us. Now, a few rules and disclaimers I'd like to make. So firstly, if you're a long-term listener, you'll know that this has got nothing to do with partisan, Republican versus Democrat BS. You'll know how the proof of weapons network, you don't fall for those psyops of distraction, thinking that changing the leadership changes the system, because it doesn't. It just gives you a few little new flavors and ingredients in order to be distracted, thinking that your vote actually matters. When the only vote that really matters is the lobby vote. Democracy, or quote unquote democracy, is a pay-to-play system. They basically manipulate and pay the media, and they pay the politicians to fulfill their agenda and make the people think that their vote actually matters. And then they roll over the politicians so that the politicians never go far off their agenda. And therefore you have to be in their pocket and do as they say in order to be the next politician that gets to play president and prime minister. And all around the world, I think anybody that has been a long-term listener of Bitcoin Hard Talk will understand how this game works. But there was a very weird niche with Trump. Like, people actually think that Trump is different for some reason. He is full control by the financial industrial complex faction of the proof of weapons network. And other politicians are more inclined to other factions. So Keir Starmer is part of the technical industrial complex. He's launching a digital ID, and he is also funded by the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex, because he sends a constant flow of money over to buy weapons from Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, and Raytheon, as well as reconfiguring the economy to be a data center for artificial intelligence with Larry Fink and some of the Gulf money that is facilitating that. And that's why many of the European leaders who are installed by the proof of weapons network in order to fulfill the goal of US corporate stateless national entities. We're getting our digital ID, which will definitely be integrated with Palantir, and it will definitely have a central bank digital currency eventually, so that the entire economy can be tokenized and financialized and securitized and integrated into the BlackRock Orwellian 1984 nightmare. And to stop people escaping, they'll make sure that you got your exit tax. And I've been guiding people into how to prepare for this world of Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and central bank digital currencies. And in the US, they have different flavors like stable coins, but same system. It's just one has privatized control. The other is a node in the central banking system that all points back to the Bank for International Settlements, that then is led into the Federal Reserve, which is owned by the private banks and the financial industrial complex, which are public companies and owned by the asset managers that create these products in order to control the flow and create this stateless government that I call the proof of weapons network. Is kindly owned by those that have wealth. And if you don't play the right game, if you don't borrow the right weapon or financial weapon of mass destruction from JP Morgan, then you get kicked off the proof of weapons network, as often happens. So Michael Saylor, for example, is trying to get into the S&P 500. That gets them in the index funds. Once you're in the index funds, you get access to capital and financial weapons of mass destruction in order to buy more Bitcoin using more corporate bonds. And then they get to manipulate the price using their ETF and financial weapons of mass destruction and derivative empire. And so people graduate into this network. And once you're in, you're not allowed out. You may be a media piece for it. Charlie Kirk was a media piece for a faction of the military industrial complex. Now, he may not know who he works for because he may think that he's supporting Israel. But Israel is just a node and a colony of the network that works with puppets like Netanyahu, who work for the military industrial complex, and their job is to create narratives and war and destabilization to ensure that the US dollar proof of weapons network doesn't have competition. But now we're in a changing moment, and the United Nations was a good, obedient node and one of the tools and one of the weapons of the proof of weapons network. But interestingly, as power dynamics have changed, and now you're ending up in this situation where Middle Eastern Gulf money, funded by oil and diversification and gas, has now built these vast sovereign reserves, and they're able to play in the lobby game. And now they're able to play in the lobby game. They're able to reconfigure some of the politicians, and they're partnering with, with the proof of weapons network in order to take away this colonial American empire from their region and slowly reconfigure and change the chess game. And at Bitcoin Hard Talk, we always talk about these geopolitical shifts. Now, United Nations was created as part of an essential weapon of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, which was an order in order to scam the world into dollar debt dependency. And one of those vital pieces was the United Nations. And it had a Security Council. And essentially it was all the leaders of all the countries could come together and they could try and have a say in the future of some of the things that needed resolution, so we don't end up in another world war. But there was a veto power by the British Empire, the French Empire, the American Empire, and later the Chinese and also the Russian Empire. Now, what's interesting is those China and Russia have gone off into a corridor called BRICS. UK and France have been vassalized into the proof of weapons network. And then there was an operation launched by the US empire in order to reset the world order and throw Europe under the bus, which is represented by the Ukraine-Russian war. And so what they did is the CIA did a coup in 2014, installed their own leadership rather than a pro-Russian leadership. And that leadership was about funneling more weapons, i.e. printing pounds and printing euros, through the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England, and making sure that that money goes back to propping up the dollar and creating a dependency. So they did NATO expansion, and they agitated Russia, and Russia essentially and the CIA have an operation to where Ukraine won't recover. America will profit and prop up the dollar through all the weapon sales through the euro dollar. And you reset the world order and create these BRICS corridors. Now, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa that then were joined by Saudi Arabia as an observer, but also UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran, aligned around a normalization exercise in the Middle East, which was another bloc called the GCC and another bloc called ASEAN, which was all Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and various other, Cambodia, Vietnam, many of the exporting countries, they formed these alliances. And there was another bloc called the Shanghai Cooperation Council. So you had all these regional blocs that created regional sovereignty in order to de-dollarize and reset the world order. And so obviously the post-Bretton Woods world order, and I want to give this background so that we can then go into the Trump speech and we can retranslate it from an understanding of what's really happening in the world rather than the cartoonish, MAGA narrative that is designed to deceive you into thinking something else is happening. But you had these different blocks, and the BRICS bloc worked with the GCC bloc, and the GCC were the countries that were colonized by France, by Britain, by factions of Imperial Soviet Union, which is no longer with us, obviously, a little bit of Italy, but mainly the American Empire. And the post-Bretton Woods system was an elaborate scheme to get the world onto dollar debt dependency. That's how the British Empire grew its empire, with the formation of the Bank of England. And so rewind all the way back to World War I. You had the formation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, which was a node of the proof of weapons network created by many of the European banking families in partnership with some of the large oil producers in America. Now, America in its formation was founded by Europeans that genocided and did settler colonialism in order to take over all the oil resources in what we call the United States of America today. And so they had those oil wealth and the Industrial Revolution, and there was a battle, 3 central banks in the US in order to, and obviously, we had the British and American history. You had the Europeans that settled and genocided the native Indians, took over various land, and there were settlements, for example, with Napoleon, where Napoleon was anti-central bank, and so it took on, Napoleon took on the French central bank and said, rather than taking on debt to fund this war, we'll sell Louisiana to the Americans. And so, you had this conquest of oil, but in the Industrial Revolution, America didn't enter the wars, but there were many financial wars that happened between the Europeans and the Americans. And the Europeans and the Brits managed to get 2 central banks installed, but there were monetary reformers that fought back against those central banks. Now, eventually, they got the Federal Reserve in 1913. And immediately, with the Federal Reserve, we entered into a moment like we're experiencing today at the United Nations meeting, which was a reset of the world order. The British Empire was bankrupted by the Bank of England. Colonialism and mercantilism and gold expeditions and financial weapons of mass destructions being fired meant that the world got too complicated and the British Empire was bankrupted by the British pound, a debt-based Ponzi scheme. Too many people wanted their gold. And so we entered into this managed transition. So the same financiers that ended up with much of the gold and decided that they were going to move to a new host nation, which is Wall Street. And so Wall Street and the Federal Reserve took over the creation of the dollar and installed the same debt-based Ponzi scheme that funded all the wars, that funded all the colonialism in the British Empire, and bankrupted eventually, because every pound was created by a central bank, and it was created by a commercial bank, and it was backed by debt. And so eventually you push out this debt through the proof of weapons network, the pound proof of weapons network at the time, and eventually you end up with a country that can no longer borrow anymore. And so we decide to change the host nation, which was America. And so America entered with the Federal Reserve. Immediately, to reset the world order, we needed an event. And so the Wall Street funded 3 different factions. It funded what was called, quote unquote, fake capitalism with the installation of the Federal Reserve. And it created a private organization that had 12 different central banks, regional central banks underneath it. And the shareholders were the private banks and the European banks, the British banks, and various other banks. And so with this network, it funded a Bolshevik revolution, which was the overthrow of the Russian Tsar with the Soviet Union, that became essentially the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx. So that ideology set one side. The other was fake capitalism, which was it didn't have hard money, and it had the Federal Reserve and a debt-based Ponzi scheme that was going to get the government into debt slowly over time, and all the nation in debt, and all the corporations in debt. And so you had the fake capitalism, you had communism, and then it also funded, via the Bank for International Settlements, fascist Nazi Germany. And so you had this fascism, communism, and fake capitalism. And Wall Street funded all of it. So, for example, when Hitler decided that he was going to go into the Czechoslovakia, the Bank for International Settlements that stored the Czechoslovakian gold at both the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and the Swiss central bank would just change the ownership, and now Nazi Germany had that gold. And eventually, we entered into this World War II era. And in World War II, with the creation of the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb, entered into a chapter reset that culminated in the meeting in Bretton Woods. Now, in Bretton Woods, there was an agreement, and that agreement was that everybody would, or the major currencies would convert their currency into the dollar, but the dollar could be convertible into gold at any moment. And so America had stolen all of its citizens' gold through gold confiscation. It ended up with all the British Empire and colonial gold, a chunk of the Russian Soviet Union gold, and much of the Nazi Germany gold all ended up in Fort Knox. And it was estimated approximately 75% of the world's gold. It didn't get bombed. And so it built a manufacturing base that was able to fund all the wars. And so in order to perpetuate the dollar globally, it had the World Bank that would lend dollars to anybody that submitted to their violent regime, the International Monetary Fund that would convert international currencies into dollars, and allow them to take those dollars and buy Wall Street products, which were loans to the US government, the bond, the treasury market. And so they would pay some interest, and they would build this position of debt the more wars that would be fought. And they had this military base that came into the military industrial complex. We then had other parts. So you had the United Nations, where they were able to force everybody into, what they wrote, the rules, international law, and people could complain, but it would only be a function of enforcing American rules on everybody else. They didn't anticipate that the everybody else would start using it, and one day the genocide convention and the definition of genocide would be used on one of its colonies, Israel. Anyway, so back to the Bretton Woods. So you had United Nations, you had the central banking system, you had the military industrial complex, and then you needed a mechanism for funding covert wars. So they created the CIA, and the CIA was formed from the factions of Nazi Germany that came over to covert operations within America, the Italian mafia, and the Jewish mob. And when I say Jewish mob, people will say, isn't that anti-Semitic? No, I mean the Jewish people that were part of the mafia, just like the Italian people that were part of the mafia. That doesn't include the Italians that weren't part of the mafia. But these were the main factions of power. And they created the CIA, and then the CIA would basically launch covert wars. And we had this whole banana republic concept where they would partner with corporate interest, and they would, do these what we call deep state exercises today, in order to overthrow countries, in order to replace their leadership through colored revolutions, through wars, through any type of violence that they could come up with to force them into a dollar standard. And so you had this Bank for International Settlements, where every time they created a new node, a new central bank, you would become a member of the IMF so that you could convert your currency into dollars. And those dollars were meant to be backed by the gold, and they were backed by the gold. And then you would become a shareholder in the Bank for International Settlements in order to coordinate this proof of weapons network through financial weapons of mass destruction. And so neo-colonialism was set by the American empire. And so all it was is about everything you could do to push out more dollar debt. So you had the IMF to push out debt. You had the CIA to do covert wars and covert operations. You had the United Nations to set the rules and a Security Council that could outvote any international objection to these covert wars. And that was really the entire construct of the early post-World War II Bretton Woods New Order. And you had a narrative that would weaponize religions in order to recruit armies and make people think they're doing God's work by selling weapons. Now, the CIA needed to be funded. And so it was funded via a money laundering scheme, which was a partnership with the Vatican Bank. And the Vatican Bank would push all of these, network of funds around this network. And they would have black op funds that sat outside the quote unquote democracy. And so people would think if you get a vote, you get Congress, you get Senate, you get judicial. But much of the operations would sit outside that through these black op operations. And so they used human trafficking, child trafficking, weapons trafficking, drug trafficking, and all sorts of weapons trafficking networks in order to fund the CIA and these black op operations. And then they would get different colonies into this network of intelligence and force the world onto debt dependency so that when they set a new central bank, you would print a bunch of money. It would be convertible into dollars to repay your dollar debt. And then if you ever needed that back, you could convert your dollars into gold. And that was the system. And so in order to build up countries, they would, force them into partnering, for example, on Middle Eastern oil. They would say, right, you come to us, we will build out your oil, but you need to give us 50% of the revenue forever. That was the Saudi Aramco deal. And eventually they decided to break free from that. But the condition was that you need to price that oil in dollars. This is the petrodollar. And force the demand for dollars so that whenever you have excess dollars, you would lend it to the US government by purchasing treasuries. And then we would use that in order to reinforce the proof of weapons network. And so they ended up, in some cases, a central bank would print its own money, create hyperinflation in their own country to pay off their dollar debt, and then lend it to the US government. Then the US government would do that to launch covert wars and media manipulation and various other things. And so, and then you had, once they could take over a country, they could penetrate later technology in order to become another weaponized tool, or they could ensure that you have a US base, but you have to buy US weapons. And so all of these were elaborate forced mechanisms for propping up the dollar and ensuring debt slavery. And you had the neo-colonial US empire. Now, a lot of people didn't like this. And this is why we hit this very historical point in the United Nations right now. And we're going to jump into the speech in a bit, but I just want you to understand the network and how it operates. And so they needed war. So you had the Cold War, which were funded both sides, which was, communism versus capitalism narrative. They also used propaganda to push that out, to make people justify why they were fighting the right side of the war when they were funding both sides. You then had like the Korean War, the Asian War. You had, the Vietnamese War. And once, the boogie monster communism fell because Soviet Union and communism was a failed ideology, it fell apart. America became the unipolar hegemon of the world. Now, prior to that fall in 1971, during the Vietnamese War, America was about to go bankrupt because even France turned up with a ship and said, give me my gold back. And once they came back and asked for that gold, America said, well, I don't think we have it. And so Nixon in 1971 closed the gold window with the Nixon shock and created a fiat currency standard backed by the military industrial complex that now couldn't even be converted into gold. My guess is we haven't had an audit, but the Federal Reserve built paper contracts because the gold sits on both Treasury's balance sheet and on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And so, and it's never been audited. But I guess there are paper contracts against that they use to suppress the price of gold to prop up the dollar. This all depended upon a global hegemon and the full enforcement of the dollar standard. So when the gold standard ended, we entered into an elaborate debt-based Ponzi scheme where there was no check and control. No one could convert the debt to gold. And as long as people would buy US treasuries and they could force US treasuries on people, then it didn't matter what happened to any other country. And you could use this neo-colonialism in order to destroy countries, install leaders, and extract all of the resources and assets you needed to fund your empire. And this is the US empire. This is the hegemon. The history books will be rewritten in the future. But these installed leaders that had to bow down to this network had no choice, particularly when the Soviet Union fell. And so once the Soviet Union fell, you had this massive expansion of debt since 1971, and you had this K-shaped economy. The idea was that you extract as much value from your own people by enforcing them onto debt slavery. And you do that because the banking system, every time it issues a loan, it creates a dollar. And the interest on that dollar doesn't exist. So you have to create more dollars in order to pay off the old dollars. And those that could borrow at 0% from the central bank, i.e. the banks, and those that could create the dollar every time they issue a loan, they would extract all of the wealth as long as people would go deeper into debt. And so individuals would go deeper into debt. Now, the ones that borrowed in order to buy assets and could get the cheapest rate, they would beat the inflation that was caused by this debt-based Ponzi scheme. And so because the price of their assets, their real estate, their gold, their stocks, or whatever, went up at a faster rate than the inflation that was being created, those that were on the wrong side, that were borrowing to consume or saving fiat currency in their bank, would get poorer and poorer and poorer until eventually you have this K-shaped economy where all of the assets end up in the hands of a few and everybody else ends up in debt slavery. And maybe you need a universal basic income or some kind of radical change. But as more people are shafted by the system, you get populism and you get extreme left and right leaders. And as the left and right get more extreme, you get people that are shafted by the system that become radicalized. And you get those that own all the assets that plan their exit. And so all they do is they pay the lobbies and pay the politicians to enforce their proof of weapons network and their power structure. And these people get angrier and angrier and angrier. And eventually it ends in civil unrest. When you have civil unrest, you tend to have external wars, or you have external financial wars rather than physical wars, which brings us to where we are today. Now, there were trade wars. China was a rising power. China decided that through this mechanism, it would become the manufacturing base of the world, and it invested in that. America became the exporter of debt around the world and run a twin deficit. The rules of having a world reserve currency is that you need to export debt, which means that you continually have a trade deficit and a fiscal deficit. Fiscal means you spend more than you bring in tax, and you need to subsidize the difference through selling treasuries. And trade deficit means you import more than you export. And so this led to China having a massive surplus and America having a massive deficit. And this overvalues the currency because it artificially makes everyone sell their currencies to buy dollars, to buy those products, And then with their reserves, they lend it to the US government and it goes round in this circle. But it's still a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And it inevitably, predictably, and guaranteed implodes upon itself eventually. Because no politician is paid to reverse the system. And so you have to, what happened, if you've been watching Bitcoin Hard Talk, is on April the 2nd, 2025, I talked about how Trump was installed in order to reset the world order because he'd already lost the trade war with China. And Liberation Day was to ruin the relationship between America and all of the partners. And I said, this will be a consolidation of power into the proof of weapons network. Because America, the American empire, through investment banking, financialized, securitized, and turned everything into a product that Wall Street could buy. And then BlackRock and the asset managers were able to get everybody to give their pension, their endowment funds, their student, and this whole elaborate scheme in order to end up with all the assets. And then they create technology control monetary policy through the Fed and technology to control fiscal policy through Treasury. And they created a covert structure that was more in power that governments were subordinate to. And so they could buy politicians, install presidents, reset orders. And one of the things it decides to do is it doesn't align itself with America anymore. It's not nationalist. Now, it has vassalized Israel, Europe, UK, Canada, Australia, and consolidated Europe into the European Union. And now we have this power structure that mainly is BlackRock as CEO that anyone can buy those shares of. So Saudi can buy those shares, China can buy those shares, it's an open market. And so this builds new allegiances based upon who owns those shares. Now, some people talk about how Jews rule the entire world, but actually they own a faction of that network and a lot of CEO seats. And there's only 16 million people. They own a lot of that network because they are part of the American system. But it's actually a decentralized network. And you see all these deals that are being done. You have Gulf countries, you have Christian aligned finance, which is about 55% of it, atheist aligned finance, 36%. Then you have Muslim aligned finance, about 6%, Hindu, 3%, obviously the rise of China, and then Jewish, about 1%, according to the stats. Now, the stats are not perfect. I'm sure that there are discrepancies in there. But, I've covered this in many times so that people can understand that power dynamics changed and they control the collective West. And then we have these blocks that were formed that are now becoming more powerful, buying all of the American, European, Israeli, Australian, Canadian assets and becoming a power resistance against it. And so what does the proof of weapons network do? Well, they say, we'll use the dollar for as long as we can. And then I'll get into the speech shortly. And then that sets the foundation for understanding Trump's speech. And eventually, we won't be able to control the dollar because it's in fiscal dominance debt spiral, but we'll partner with the different factions of the world. And so when we install Trump, we can have Liberation Day on April the 2nd. It will allow us to acquire all the distressed companies, consolidate power into the corporate structure, and also reset the world order into these power blocks, into BRICS, GCC, ASEAN, SCO, and we'll shrink America into a regional power. And we'll need to figure out how we reset the portfolio accordingly. Now, that's what's happened this year. Now, the United Nations meeting that we just saw is many of these games were played in order to reset the chessboard. Mainly the Ukraine-Russian war, which was a war not on Russia, it was a war on Europe to vassalize it into the proof of weapons network. And also the October the 7th false flag, which if you watch my blog, Atrocity Inc., was a hostage swap operation, but it wasn't anything that you were told it was. And all the evidence is pointed out on simondixon.com. Go to the blog, type in atrocity, and you'll see all the sources. And that propaganda is still being spread. But it set a game that allowed for the US colony Israel to become a pariah state and America to become an isolated state, but dress it in the narrative of MAGA American strength and this Judeo-Christian alliance, while they negotiate with the sovereign wealth funds and reset the world order into the next rising power, which is China, but regional blocks and regional sovereignty. And so that sets the scene. And I just wanted to cover that because now what we're going to do is Azad's going to start at the beginning of the Trump speech. And this speech, I'm going to go through the macro and geopolitical consequences and retranslate it into truth so that you can understand the lies. Again, and one rule, I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I used to do this with, I would do it with Obama, I would do it with Clinton, and I will do it with Trump. Because I don't believe that I believe it's a psyop, this left-right bollocks. And so it's nothing to do with Trump derangement syndrome. I'm critiquing the leader so that you can see past the bullshit, so that you can get ahead. And at the very end of this, I'll help you understand what you can do to protect yourself if you understand how the world actually works by following the money rather than following the media. I wanted to cover a few concepts in terms of the macro side around how Trump is running the economy right now. So he's doing what and he won't tell you this is the strategy, but the strategy he is following right now is called fiscal dominance. Fiscal dominance means that you find any way to print as much money as possible and auction off as much debt as possible. And then through crony capitalism, you create bills that recycle that money to prop up the stock market. And so if you look at, for example, the Big Beautiful Bill, what did it do? Well, it created a $1.3 trillion budget, and it had budgets to go to the Pentagon, i.e. the Department of War, it's now called, and various other factions like technology, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and then some of the obligations it has, through basically the government debt and the interest on the debt comes from, four main obligations: war, Medicare, Social Security, and the interest on the debt. Now, if you remember, we rewind back when Elon Musk came in, he created this theater that he was going to try and pay down the debt. What does that mean? Remember the introduction. Fiscal, if you want to be world reserve currency, you have to have a twin deficit. And so if you pay down the debt, you create a depression because the dollar is debt. And so obviously they couldn't do that. But what did they get? They got the Department of Government Efficiency to take all the data and put it through into an algorithm, which is very useful if you're building artificial intelligence and social credit scores and some of the systems that have been built by these Elon Musk and Peter Thiels in the UK with the digital ID and integration with central bank digital currencies at the moment. These type of systems are very useful. And what else did he do? He increased the debt ceiling to $5 trillion. Right. So he's bought himself $5 trillion of runway. And now we're about to enter into the drama of the government shutdown. This is where basically the Republicans and the Democrats and their relative lobbies, they all represent the interest, and the lobbies own both sides, that they're trying to push forward, and they argue and they manage to get out more budgets for their corporation. And so if you're funded by the military industrial complex or the financial industrial complex or the technical industrial complex or the pharmaceutical industrial complex or the consumption industrial complex, then you spread your money across all these prostitutes that call themselves Congress and Senate. And through the CIA ops, you can have some of your slush fund and black op money bribe judicial as needed, or run Epstein file type of operations, or funnel money into colonies like Israel, where they get some of the money. You do all the illegal activity over there, and then the money goes back into companies like Google that acquire the companies in Israel. Or you can do genocide as a service, technology testing, occupation as a service, integration with drones, various other crimes against humanity. You get to test it via your colony and have plausible deniability because it didn't happen in your server in your country. Now, eventually, that comes back into the American stock market. And so this is the money laundering scheme when you follow the money. And BlackRock, which controls all the ETFs, they have the S&P 500 ETF, they have the Israeli Stock Exchange ETF. And so everybody giving their passive income to BlackRock means that they get to acquire shares in all these companies. They get to construct deals with each other. And they get to manipulate through access to finance, through bond market, corporate debt market, private equity market, stock market, elaborate schemes in order to prop up the price of those shares and put board seats on these corporations. And so the Big Beautiful Bill was just a way of getting money to Palantir, money to Lockheed Martin, money to X via space wars and all sorts of stuff. To get so that you could prop up the economy through government debt and spend that into the corporation to prop up the price of stocks so that it doesn't reflect any reality or valuation. And so what Trump will brag about is that the stock market is at all-time high, which is correct. The stock market is at all-time high. And if you can use that in order to leverage the stocks at all-time high, then the executives and the people that own those stocks get richer. But those that don't own the stocks, they end up with all the no assets and all the inflation from the money printing. So running the economy hot through fiscal dominance means that you no longer have a Federal Reserve that is able to work on its twin mandate, which is inflation and unemployment. And so Trump installs 4 members to the Federal Reserve, and now they can become puppets for the Treasury or the administration. And you lose what is called the independence relationship between the Fed. Now, in reality, it's the same, because who's the Federal Reserve owned by? The banks. And who's one of the largest lobbies? The banking lobby. And who does Trump represent? He's way more aligned with the financial industrial complex because he's a deal maker. And so his job is to funnel money for the banks into corporations that can increase their stock price, and all of his buddies can make a shitload of money, and he can make a shitload of money out of leaving the average American with all the inflation, and they get the assets that outperform the inflation. And this basically is an attack on Main Street, just like tariffs. The corporates pay the tariff. Why? Because America is a net importer. The importer pays the tariffs, the exporter doesn't. And so therefore, the American corporation pays pays the tariff, or they increase their price. And so we've got all this inflation to be factored in through the tariff policy. Plus, America government gets $350 million in tariff income from American corporations. Now, the medium-sized business can't afford that. Just like COVID, they end up with record merger and acquisitions, record activity. And this private companies basically gets, gobbled up into consolidation of the large multinational corporation, i.e. the BlackRock portfolio companies. So you end up with an attack on Main Street for Wall Street. That also happens in the export-dependent countries, Vietnam, Cambodia. You can vassalize them into the BlackRock portfolio companies. And these are global institutions that work with, a non-America first agenda. They align with BRICS, they align with GCC, and they co-invest. And in fact, BlackRock's office is now being opened in Saudi Arabia because of all this inbound investment. So what does Trump brag about? He brags about the money coming in from tariff, which is a tax on the American people, consolidation of small business into private equity, into large corporations, and he opens up your 401k to private equity. So he's dumping these these stocks that the institutions hold onto your pension. And he then brags about the additional tax that the middle-sized business paid. and negotiates deals with the large multinational corporation that can offset the tariff because they are international. And so they can offset this and they can say, right, we'll invest into a new factory here, or we'll move our factory, our Apple factory from China to India, or whatever is needed in this construct. So he brags about the tax that he receives. He brags about the stock market being at all-time high. And then he brags about the amount of inbound investment. So he said $17 trillion of investment is coming into America. Now, if that is American corporations investing dollars in their own country to rebuild a manufacturing base, then that has an impact. But the impact is that those goods are going to be really expensive because Americans are more expensive than manufacturing in China. You can't change that trend. You can't rebuild all this manufacturing base within an expensive economy unless you're going to significantly weaken your currency and devalue your currency and radically change the economy, which would require a depression and not fiscal dominance. It would require monetary reform rather than tax reform. And so the only way you can do that is through AI and robotics. And so obviously all the money is going into AI and robotics. And that has a side effect. It creates unemployment. And so the Americans are going to lose their job. Main Street is going to be screwed to Wall Street. You have consolidation of power. And what is this $7 trillion of investment? Most of it is coming from external countries. So who are those external countries? Well, it's the countries that have sovereign wealth, which is the Middle Eastern countries. Japan has a lot of debt, but also has a trade surplus and a lot of assets. But Japan is selling off its assets because it's changing and shifting away from America in terms of it's going more to the east rather than west. And so you can only force Europeans into, or your neighbors into this. So Latin America, South America, Canada, Mexico, Alaska, Greenland, Europe. And America can only influence its sphere of influence as well. Right. So what is that $17 trillion? Well, the way that foreign direct investment works is it works the same way as the IMF works. What was the model of the IMF? It was enslave the world, acquire their assets, and take over their industry. So in reverse, if you've got sovereign wealth and you're investing $17 trillion, and the number's nothing like that, these are just memorandum of association. There's about $5 trillion of sovereign wealth across the Gulf states in the GCC. But when you invest it, you become the owner of the asset and you become the lender. What was the neo-colonial model of the American empire? It was private equity, IMF loans, debt slavery, and equity dependency, financialization, securitization, and now tokenization. And so now the sovereign wealth is partnering with BlackRock and acquiring those assets. So they're asset stripping America, they're asset stripping Europe. And when you're doing an asset stripping operation and you're managing a portfolio like BlackRock is, you have a lovely little pipeline. You could say, let's profit from war here, military industrial complex. That then creates a rebuild contract for the financial industrial complex. And then we could rebuild and build back better with our technology and the technical industrial complex and our construction deals that we built like through Afghanistan. And so you have this very elaborate money laundering scheme where the American people pay the inflation, but the dollars end up back in the corporate interest, which pumps up the stock, which creates more wealth inequality. And the corporations have this crony capitalism that benefits. And then they buy the government through lobby and force the government or push the government, or just they don't even need to be pushed. Many of these politicians, give me the money, I'll do it. I don't need to be pushed. I'll just take the money. And then they push their interest. And this is how you prop up the dollar, right? So now that's working in reverse. So now you've got foreign direct investment where foreign countries are buying all of the AI assets. And then what comes with that? Well, suddenly China says, I'll do a deal for NVIDIA chips. And now Trump says NVIDIA chips are able to export to China. China says we won't take them. We'll constrict our rare earth minerals. That resets the world order. And that creates more distress. And then Trump says, well, we'll build our own semiconductor chips. I'll acquire Intel. And then you have this reset of the world order to America being a regional power only. and the blocs being able to fight back against the dollar. And so April the 2nd was Liberation Day. It liberated the world from the dollar. Now, China has been investing in all of these regions like Africa, like the Middle East, and they're a customer. And in their deals, they don't do what the IMF did. They just say, we want you to be a consumer, so we'll invest in your infrastructure and we'll allow you to use your resources to build your own products, give some of us some of those resources, and we'll reset the order, but you got to price it in our currency. And so Saudi now said, all right, we used to price in dollars. We still do. It's an important relationship. But we're going to do the oil that we sell to you, China, is going to be in yuan. And so you have the petro yuan as well as the petro dollar. And so when Saudi and the Middle East want to reset the world order, they do it through investments. And so America has built all these military bases, and we're now using the Palestinian cause as a negotiation and leverage technique in order to reset the world order so that the Middle East can be in this between these different blocks, the GCC blocks, the BRICS bloc, and America controlling the regional power. But America is vassalized into BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network. And the Proof of Weapons Network is moving the world to multipolarity. And Trump works for the financial industrial complex. Netanyahu works for the military industrial complex. Elon Musk works for the technical industrial complex. Peter Thiel works for the technical industrial complex. And, you know, you can pull TikTok in and various other things. So this is what we're seeing right now. And remember, if you are military, and I've given all this because I wanted to give us our time to get this new video up. But if you're military, you can't lose revenue. So if you decide we're not going to profit from war in the Middle East anymore, then Israel is no longer that important to us. And so I don't want to go through it now, but if you watch any of my previous episodes, I go through each geopolitical event, i.e. the strikes in Qatar from Iran and from Israel, and how you have theater to manage a divorce because Israel is a toxic asset that's being vassalized into the GCC, and so will the entire Levant. And Iran, working with BRICS and Russia and China, has normalized with Saudi Arabia, and they are all in line into a de-dollarization exercise so that we can move to this multipolar world and global power shifts. And obviously the sacrifice for that was Europe. And so Russia had to switch off its gas. CIA blows up Nord Stream pipeline, installs a corrupt politician, Zelensky, into Ukraine, changes all the European leadership through installing Keir Starmer, Macron, Merz, the European Union, and they all reset the world order to turn Europe into a toxic asset. And then from the wars, you have open border policy so that you can manufacture and use your control of media to push up racial tensions and religious tensions. People get angry because they're like, why is our politicians doing this? And then you can manufacture civil unrest so you can vassalize all of these countries into a technocracy, artificial intelligence, asset stripped, asset acquired, Orwellian 1984 nightmare. And you take the techniques of colonialism and war, death, destruction, rape, pillaging, grooming gangs that the armies were implanted into all these countries over time, and you bring them back home. And when you bring them back home, you take the same techniques, and now you can make up for lost profits. And so the Ukraine war doesn't end because it's engineered not to end. It is resource extraction. It is financialization. And it is designed to crash Europe from its cheap energy and make it a dependency upon the US regional power and BlackRock to acquire all the distressed assets and build these artificial intelligence data centers that need water and energy. And so that's what we're having. The problem that Europe had is its neighbors with America. Right, so let me just do a quick summary. And to give you a little summary, and then we'll go to the next section. So basically, Trump was bragging about his key performance indicators in the economy. I said that this is about running the economy hot through fiscal dominance, where monetary policy becomes less relevant and only at all reducing interest rate, not to fix inflation, not to fix unemployment, but to actually make the government debt cheaper. Now, it doesn't mean that they're paying down the debt, because the dollar is debt and you can't pay down the debt without creating a depression. And so you always have to roll over the debt. And because America is a world reserve currency, you have to have a twin deficit. You have to export more than you have to import more than you export, and you have to spend more than you collect in revenue and tax. And you need to perpetuate debt forever. And so any talk about combating that means you have to have a monetary reform, and there is no monetary reform. We just had tax reform. And the tax reform is to increase the debt while collecting more tax from American companies and having a hidden tax called inflation. And so Trump will brag about the stock market, but what he's actually done, he has increased the twin deficit. So he has run the economy hot by importing more than he's exporting, and by spending more than he's bringing in tax revenue. So that's the twin deficit, which means that you've increased the debt. And so we're now at over $37 trillion debt. Now, when you run the economy hot, you increase the K-shaped economy. Those with assets get richer. Those without assets pay the inflation. This is cumulative inflation. So every year, if it's 3% at the moment, you already get an additional 3% on top of what you couldn't afford, and wages are not increasing at the same rate either. Now, that means that you get consumer price inflation and asset price inflation, which perpetuates the K-shaped economy, wealth inequality, civil unrest. Those that benefit from this is the stock market. So he'll talk about how stocks are at all-time high, which is correct. And then he talks about the $17 trillion of foreign direct investment, which means that America is selling its assets to foreign ownership. Then he'll talk about tariff revenue income, which is essentially a tax on the American small business, while the large company negotiates it through structuring so that it doesn't impact. So this is concentration of wealth, concentration of power, and the recipients of all the additional money that is being printed is surveillance state, police state technology like Palantir, military companies, and various other artificial intelligence, which is about building the robotics and software in order to make it where you can replace the jobs with artificial intelligence and robotics. So now, after we've had that, Trump-style rally type of presentation, and we've retranslated that into the macro side, he then jumps into the geopolitical side, and he is obviously pitching for Nobel Peace Prize, which I predicted he will get, because there is many of the geopolitical stuff that we cover every single week around the fact that China has normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is going to lead to the eventual Abraham Accords, while America profits from the genocide. The genocide ends with the current negotiation for BlackRock, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic with the Gulf countries. And we move to the next phase that I've been predicting, which is the implementation of Build Back Better, American slow retreat, and vassalization of the Levant into the GCC, including Israel. And Israel is no longer funded by the military-industrial complex. And so therefore, we reset the world order, which eventually he'll call Abraham Accords. Iran goes further east with BRICS. And we enter into this normalization phase and decolonization phase. Okay, so now he'll start bragging about the wars. So remember, this is in front of the leaders of all the countries, which in general, almost all these global south countries are the victims of resource extraction and covert operations in order to overthrow their government and fund insurgents through US proxies like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, M13, M23, which then steal resources, and then they go through the black op operations in order to get the components needed for pushing up the stocks in US. So let's go to the next section where he talks about why he should have a Nobel Peace Prize.
I believe closer than ever before My administration has negotiated one historic trade deal after another, including with the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, and many, many others. Likewise, in a period of just 7 months, I have ended 7 unendable wars. They said they were unendable. You're never going to get them solved. Some were going for 31 years, 2 of them, 31, think of it, 31 years. One was 36 years. One was 28 years. I ended 7 wars. And in all cases, they were raging with countless thousands of people being killed. This includes Cambodia and Thailand, Kosovo and Serbia, the Congo and Rwanda, a vicious, violent war that was, Pakistan and India, Israel and Iran, Egypt and Ethiopia, and Armenia and Azerbaijan. It included all of them. No president or prime minister, and for that matter, no other country has ever done anything close to that. And I did it in just 7 months. It's never happened before. There's never been anything like that. I'm very honored to have done it. It's too bad that I had to do these things instead of the United Nations doing them. And sadly, in all cases, they did not even try to help in any of them. I ended 7 wars, dealt with the leaders of each and every one of these countries, and never even received a phone call from the United Nations offering to help in finalizing the deal. All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped right in the middle. If the First Lady wasn't in great shape, she would have fallen, but she's in great shape. We're both in good shape. We both stood. And then a teleprompter that didn't work. These are the 2 things I got from the United Nations, a bad escalator and a bad teleprompter. Thank you very much. And by the way, it's working now. It just went on. Thank you. I think I should just do it the other way. It's easier. Thank you very much. I didn't think of it at the time because I was too busy working to save millions of lives. That is the saving and stopping of these wars. But later I realized that the United Nations wasn't there for us. They weren't there. I thought of it really after the fact, not during these negotiations, which were not easy. That being the case, what is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential. I've always said it. It has such tremendous, tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential. For the most part, at least for now, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. It's empty words, and empty words don't solve war. The only thing that solves war and wars is action. Now, after ending all of these wars and also earlier negotiating the Abraham Accords, which is a very big thing for which our country received no credit, never receives credit. Everyone says that I should get the Nobel Peace Prize for each one of these achievements. But for me, the real prize will be the sons and daughters who live to grow up with their mothers and fathers, because millions of people are no longer being killed in endless and unglorious wars. What I care about is not winning prizes, it's saving lives. We saved millions and millions of lives with the 7 wars. And we have others that we're working on, and you know that. Many years ago, a very successful real estate developer in New York, known as Donald J. Trump.
Okay, let's take a little bit of a pause here. So Trump's going to go into one of his stories about real estate. But I want you to understand how gaslighting this must be. So for anybody that has half a brain that doesn't buy into the narrative that the US has had to sell you about the dollar and the proof of weapons network, you'll know that the military industrial complex and United Nations has always been weaponized by US, who has a veto vote over any type of resolution. And so for multiple decades, the US has pretended that it's negotiating peace between Israel and Palestine while veto voting to make sure that there never is peace. And so if you've watched any UN Security Councils, you'll know that historically you'd had UK and France that would abstain, but it's always been Russia and China have always, voted for peace. And then US has always veto voted for Israel because Israel is a colony of the US with plausible deniability so that they can pretend that the crimes against humanity that Israel is committing on the global south and in the Middle East and the Levant is not actually US, even though it's all for the profits of the US military industrial complex through what I've explained. So you can imagine how people feel when Trump is pretending that he wants to prevent deaths, knowing that all of the deaths are responsible because of the US to prop up the dollar. And so this is a typical, MAGA narrative of I am the president of peace and I want to end peace, while he knows systemically that in order to prop up the dollar, you need more war. And in order to get the resources that America wants for its artificial intelligence, it needs to extract more resources from Africa. It needs to extract more resources from Latin and South America. And now it doesn't need the oil in the Middle East anymore because it's created fracking. And fracking meant that America is now the largest exporter of oil and gas, which is why it launched wars in order to ensure that Europe is buying its gas now, because it can't influence outside of its sphere as a regional power, and so it can only go to the regions. And so over the British Empire and the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and the US Empire, there have been hundreds of millions of deaths as a result of these covert operations. If you combine the different wars, plus the funding of militia groups, plus all the different expedites of the British Empire, you can, the history that will be rewritten, because the American Empire, if it falls now or if it retreats into regional, is a very short empire relative to other empires. So if you look at the entire history of empires, whether it be the multiple millennia of the Roman empires, or you look at the Ottoman Empire, this has really been a very short empire in terms of the British Empire than the American Empire. So, it's not been sustainable because it's been built upon a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And it has been so destructive and caused so many deaths that everybody in the room will know about the deaths and the operations. And obviously, they'll know that United Nations was always weaponized, which is interesting because now that there are other regional powers, the global South countries have choices. And because they're now able to trade with China and are able to trade with other countries, they've overwhelmingly been choosing China because it's less predatory, doesn't involve regime change, and doesn't involve, the massive predatory deals that have been negotiated by the IMF and the Proof of Weapons Network. And so they've started to actually use the United Nations against the US, against Israel. And that was never part of the plan. So immediately, Trump sanctions the courts, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, because it wasn't ever meant to be used against the US. And so there is this is the removal of American soft power drafted in a MAGA cloak. So organizations like USAID is how all of these covert wars and black ops were funded. When you close it down, you probably replace it with something else, but it's the removal of soft power in other parts of the region. So if America ends up defunding or leaving United Nations or discredits United Nations, the goal is clearly to make America very isolationist and Israel a pariah state, so that these can have more strategic acquisitions from those that control the financial and capital market flows, which is happening at the same time as managing their portfolio and using the dollar to prop up the stock market and the K-shaped economy for as long as possible until they start, creating financial products denominated in alternative currencies or using the Federal Reserve rates by its shareholders, the banks, in order to reset the world order as needed. But obviously it's going through this predatory exercise and reallocating revenue back home by raging civil unrest campaigns on its own people, wars in Europe, and escalating, in Latin America, pretending it's about drugs when the CIA is the one that runs all those drug cartels and black op operation. And Trump knows that, and everybody that is able to play president knows that as well. So all of those deaths were responsible to back up the dollar. The dollar is backed by death and destruction and genocide and ethnic cleansing and raping and pillaging. And in order to make sure that there isn't peace, the US has used its veto vote to make sure that it doesn't happen. And so I'll just pick a few of these wars that he mentioned. He mentioned 7 that he wants a Nobel Peace Prize for. And I predict he will get the Nobel Peace Prize because that's part of being president and working for BlackRock and the financial industrial complex, resetting the world order through tariffs, and engaging in the dollar destabilization campaign, which has really radically devalued the dollar and led to capital outflows from countries that are divesting in those bonds in order to shrink America into a regional power, allowing the foreign direct investment, and then obviously handing over the economy through crypto, stable coins, and other technologies to the proof of weapons network. But some of those wars, let's have a look at them. So Congo, for example, Congo is at war with Rwanda. Rwanda is a Western proxy that has funded militias like M23. And M23 has been used to destabilize the Republic of Congo so that those resources can be stolen, siphoned off into Rwanda, and then via Europe, they get into supporting Apple with the components that it needs, and the various other components that build all the laptops and technology in America. But they don't allow Congo. They have to just give them, they either steal the resources or they sell them at cost, and install corrupt, politicians in destabilization campaigns through covert wars, rather than allowing Congo to actually have investment in building its own factories, its own manufacturing base, and build the final product. Now, certain regions like Burkina Faso are now chucking out American imperialists and Russian imperialists and saying, we will build up our own manufacturing base and we will take funding and investment from the Belt and Road Initiative as well. And so countries are doing that and they're finding their own models. But Congo is in the middle of violence at the moment. And America will, when they decide to retreat or negotiate an exit deal, they then say and call themselves peace brokers. Now, Pakistan is the same one. Pakistan has been, borders with Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a forever war so that America could print $2 trillion, replace the Taliban with the Taliban, pretend that it is the same as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, after 9/11 and pre-9/11, was funded by the CIA. They created those training camps in Saudi Arabia, funded via USAID and covert operations, in order to create the fake war on terror so that you could confuse and radicalize the American people through operations like 9/11 into justifying destabilization campaigns and wars in the Middle East. Afghanistan was about protecting the drug routes between the CIA and their essential routes to get drugs into the US so that they can drug their own people that are not productive anymore and fund those black op operations, through Operation Gladio and various other things. And so Pakistan was neighbor with Afghanistan. Pakistan and the Taliban wanted to return Osama bin Laden because they wanted to connect the two and vassalize Pakistan through IMF debt slavery. They built military bases there and they funded much of the militia and what we call quote unquote terrorism today. And so they created the destabilization campaigns, and these are used to train armies so that they can get resources. And so Pakistan has a US base. And now, because Pakistan started accepting money from China and the Belt and Road Initiative, Pakistan started revealing more. Now, Pakistan and India have been historically on the wrong side of British colonialism, subjecting and creating these different territories. And so we had this Pakistan and India conflict earlier this year. But really, that was about the proof of weapons network trying to vassalize India in order to gain as much power in a power structure between the Belt and Road Initiative and the IMF, through i.e. China and America, and using destabilization campaigns, including the imprisonment of Imran Khan, installing a military government there. And it is in a change and struggle. And so when these negotiations are resolved, Trump says, oh, we created peace there, and the American people buy it up. We had also Iran and Israel. I covered this one earlier. And so because the GCC are now going through a decolonization exercise, because China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia, BRICS and the GCC have been able to push back against. We had October the 7th, the false flag. And now in managing this transition, where Netanyahu is negotiating his own freedom, but represents the US military-industrial complex and justifies the forever wars, and Trump representing the financial-industrial complex faction of the proof of weapons network, they are negotiating the optimum amount of genocide, occupation, death, and destruction in order to gain more leverage and plan the different routes so that they can essentially implement the plan to rebuild Gaza. But the GCC want to be in charge of their neighbors. And so Iran has held back. Qatar was funding Hamas. Qatar actually has a US base. The money was funneled via Israel. And, Hamas, while at the very top level, it was a genuine resistance. At the top level, they're involved in destabilization campaigns as well. Now, in this hostage swap operation, Hamas has already said they won't be part of leadership anymore. And America wanted Hamas political arm to have an office in Qatar. And so as part of that managed divorce, there was the 12-day war. And the 12-day war I covered live on Bitcoin Hard Talk and said, no, everyone was panicking. This would be World War III. I said, no, this is theater in order to allow America to say that they took on the Iran nuclear program, which they haven't. Israel to say we have taken out the Iranian hardliners, which I personally believe the Iran had agreed to what would be allowed to happen with the hardliners. And Iran to say that we defended ourselves and we took on Tel Aviv, and they were allowed to strike Tel Aviv, which would never have been possible before if we weren't managing a transition. Now, the result of that is Iran did a strike on Qatar, and also Israel did a strike on Qatar. Everyone was saying, this is World War III. I said, no, Qatar would have signed off on these things. And it is part of moving to the next phase so that Qatar can distance itself from hosting Hamas political wing. And we can move to the regional negotiation that the industry has agreed upon. Next, it will lead to a divorce and destabilization campaign, divorce and blame shift campaign, so the US military can say, yeah, it wasn't us, it was Israel. And so they're obviously allowing narratives that would have been unacceptable through the media networks to get through, so that America can essentially be de-radicalized. The radicalization of the evangelical Christians into confusing Prophet Israel with the political Israel that has led to so much funding and protection of Israel for the profits of the military-industrial complex, and led to the radicalization and all the wars that led to all these different groups. They're now creating a campaign to de-radicalize, because the GCC has negotiated, and that's why we're getting all this crimes against humanity. So Trump will take the credit because China did the normalization, and eventually the military will stop funding those covert, replaced with rebuild financial contracts, and Trump is negotiating for BlackRock, BlackRock get their deal because US is a BlackRock and proof of weapons vassal. And we had a reset of the order. They'll call it Abraham Accords, and Trump gets to say, I created peace. And I'm not going to go through all the other operations, but look around the world and in the United Nations, everybody, with the exception of those that have been brought up on Western media that know anything, know that this is Liberation Day from the dollar. And the leaders are all getting ready for the growth that comes from being able to finally use their resources, decolonize, and negotiate with the existing colonizers, because America power structure is turning on itself, as I've been covering throughout Bitcoin Hard Talk. All right, so that was a lot to cover. And now I think Trump moves on to the next side. So let's listen in for the next section.
I remember it so well. I said at the time that I would do it for $500 million, rebuilding everything. It would be beautiful. I used to talk about, I'm going to give you marble floors. They're going to give you terrazzo. I'm going to give you the best of everything. You're going to have mahogany.
Zod, could we forward a few minutes past this story? He's just going through like a building contract, maybe a couple of minutes, see where we end up.
Do you notice that? As far as the hand of American leadership and friendship to any nation in this assembly that is willing to join us in forging a safer, more prosperous world. And it's a world that we'll be much happier with. A dramatically better future is within our reach. But to get there, we must reject the failed approaches of the past and work together to confront some of the greatest threats in history. There is no more serious danger to our planet today than the most powerful and destructive weapons ever devised by man, of which the United States, as you know, has many. Just as I did in my first term, I've made containing these threats a top priority, starting with the nation of Iran. My position is very simple. The world's #1 sponsor of terror can never be allowed to possess the most dangerous weapon. That's why shortly after taking office, I sent the so-called Supreme Leader a letter making a generous offer. I extended a pledge of full cooperation in exchange for a suspension of Iran's nuclear program. The regime's answer was to continue their constant threats to their neighbors and U.S. interests throughout the region, and some great countries that are right nearby. Today, many of Iran's former military commanders, in fact, I can say almost all of them, are no longer with us. They're dead. And 3 months ago, in Operation Midnight Hammer, 7 American B-2 bombers dropped the 14 30,000-pound each bombs on Iran's key nuclear facilities, totally obliterating everything. No other country on earth could have done what we did. No other country has the equipment to do what we did. We have the greatest weapons on earth. We hate to use them. But we did something that for 22 years people wanted to do. With Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity demolished, I immediately brokered an end to the 12-day war, as it's called, between Israel and Iran, with both sides agreeing to fight no longer. As everyone knows, I have also been deeply engaged in seeking a ceasefire in Gaza. Have to get that done. Have to get it done. Unfortunately, Hamas has repeatedly rejected reasonable offers to make peace. We can't forget October 7th, can we? Now, as if to encourage continued conflict, some of this body is seeking to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. The rewards would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities. This would be a reward for these horrible atrocities, including October 7th, even while they refuse to release the hostages or accept a ceasefire. Instead of giving to Hamas and giving so much, because they've taken so much, they have taken so much. This could have been solved so long ago. But instead of giving in to Hamas's ransom demands, those who want peace should be united with one message: release the hostages now. Just release the hostages now. Okay. Thank you. As we have got to come together.
Let's cover a few of these stories. So let me just cover a few points here. So firstly, release the hostages. So US has veto votes. Netanyahu has stopped every single negotiation to release the hostages. 3 days after October the 7th was the first offer to release the hostages and in exchange for Israel not coming in, but it required that the Palestinian thousands of hostages that were taken by Israel before October the 7th be released, that have been subjected to sexual violence and all sorts of torture and crimes against humanity. There's many documentation for those people that are interested in actually finding that out. And so obviously Netanyahu has not been interested in releasing the hostages, which is why Israelis have been protesting every week in Israel, not for the Palestinians, because 90% of Israelis, according to some of the different types of polls, which we can't trust, but anyway, this is all we got, don't want a Palestinian state, but they do want the hostages returned, and that's caused lots of problems. So obviously the operation was to go into Gaza and level the complete playing field so that it can be rebuilt under a new profitable structure to test out much of the surveillance state for US corporations to beta test their occupation as a service, genocide as a service, and resolve the Palestinian cause once and for all as the GCC negotiates what does it take for us to govern our own region. And so any talk of hostages is about the optics in order to make Americans think that actually they're trying to release the hostages. Anyone else in the world knows that that's just simply not the case. For those of you that don't know the history of Iran, Iran wanted to basically decolonize. So the British Empire took over its oil and wanted to build its oil fields. Saudi Arabia said the British Empire is evil. We'll have to work with the American Empire. And obviously they destabilize and then they negotiate that they get 50% of all the revenue forever, not just a contract to help you extract oil, but 50% forever. Now, over time, as these countries got more powerful, they wanted to nationalize their resources and use their oil for their people so they don't have to pay tax. In America, they give the oil after the settler colonial movements over to families like the Rockefellers who set up the banks and the Federal Reserve, but they get to privatize all the oil and Americans pay tax. When the Federal Reserve came out in 1913, they introduced income tax, and the Rockefellers were part of the family that negotiated the Federal Reserve construct. And so Americans pay tax because they privatize oil, and they have to pay for the money printing through the Federal Reserve Act. In these countries, they keep their own central banks that don't create debt-based Ponzi schemes, and they use their resources in order to not charge their citizens tax. You can have more capitalism and free markets when people get to keep their own money, and you don't have this inflation debt-based Ponzi scheme. Now, that's not communism, that's not capitalism, but those are dogmas that were created in order to radicalize people onto the Republican, Democrat, left and right. Sorry if I'm doing my Trump impression there. But that's the K-shaped economy. I've just realized, I think that's Trump. He said, K-shaped economy, K-shaped economy. Iran, and not Iran, Iran, not Iran, Iran essentially wanted to nationalize its own oil. And so the British Empire and the American Empire executed a CIA coup with MI6 to overthrow the government and install a American puppet and a British puppet. Eventually, there was a resistance against that type of political interference. And they didn't want democracy in Iran. And so instead they ended up with a revolution, and that revolution wanted to nationalize the oil so it could use it for its own means. And then there was the Iran-Contra affair, where essentially America was weaponizing Iran in exchange for the hostages. And then Iran would send them over to Central and South America in order for America to extract resources through one of these CIA operations. You can look up Iran-Contra affair, while funding Israel so that you create this Operation Gladio of strategic tension between Iran and Israel that creates a black op operation and the ability for the military-industrial complex to profit from the forever war and negotiate with Saudi Arabia that it gets this flow of oil. Now, eventually, Saudi builds up its own reserves, agrees to gets forced onto the petrodollar, but over time builds up sovereign reserves where it can take back control and made part of its oil, Saudi Aramco, public, and is now at the stage where it has a partnership with BlackRock to negotiate decolonization, because America is no longer an empire. It is controlled by the proof of weapons network. So now you have this interesting phase where, you can exit the forever war and China comes along and normalizes between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I always said, once you normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia, settle the Palestinian cause, then you only get exit of the US bases being used and negotiated, and you can have regional collective sovereignty and no unnatural wars. So I believe Iran has agreed to this, so they stopped funding the Axis. And now, as part of that agreement, these are all the optics that are needed to get to the next phase. And obviously, the GCC are doing all this foreign direct investment into artificial intelligence and data centers. But the whole thing was about narrative control to radicalize you. And I told you all the terrorism was Western funded. And they were radicalized because of the wars. You blow up their mom, their children, and kill 1 million civilians, as Julian Assange taught us in the WikiLeaks. Then you get a nice army that you can utilize, infiltrate the top, destabilize countries, and ensure there's no competition to America to prop up the dollar. Now that is all changing. And so there was never negotiation for hostages, but once that deal is negotiated, you'll get the return of hostages. Trump gets to say that he did it. And you get this creative divorce, the destabilization of the Israeli cabinet, probably the exit of Netanyahu, and then the next phase of rebuild as America shrinks to a regional power. And then slowly over time, those US bases become used for sovereign bases as well. Now, Iran had a nuclear program, and when you surround Iran with American bases, they start to use their nuclear energy program in order to enrich uranium and potentially build a defensive nuclear bomb. But they have also said that they never have, because it's against their religion. And we've always, for 30 years, anytime you want to push the forever war, they can scare the shit out of you. And Netanyahu, representing the military-industrial complex, can come along and say, Iran's about to have a weapon of mass destruction. Iraq, Sudan, Libya. And it was all about theft of resources, ensuring that the dollar has no competition. And now, finally, the world has changed because America is energy independent and an exporter, and so no longer needs those. So Israel becomes less important. BlackRock takes over America, and there is no nationalist agenda anymore. And so these are the different, brief history. We could go deeper. But now America has submitted the Gaza plan, which was done by Tony Blair. Tony Blair, the consultant that led the UK into the Iraq war when Saddam Hussein was originally a CIA ally, and Netanyahu destabilized that region and then immediately set Iran and Iraq into war against each other. Death and destruction, 8-year war, gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, while also simultaneously funding Iran. And then that war led to all of the Iraq army and all of the weapons going out to these different groups. And then Al-Qaeda, ISIS were created, infiltrated by the West, and used in order to destabilize Africa, in Nigeria at the moment, and all the different areas wherever you want to create war. Radicalize the Americans into justifying all the war, and then this props up the dollar through this elaborate money laundering scheme. Now we're moving to the next phase. Tony Blair put forward the plan, and the plan is to tokenize Gaza. And Trump has a fund with his son, Harry Kushner, and Harry Kushner wants to build Trump Towers in Gaza, across the Middle East, one in Saudi, one in Dubai. Trump is essentially, if he can, as he be a good boy for BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network, he gets to borrow money from China, do deals with the different Gulf regions, create stable coins and all the other things I've covered in Bitcoin Hard Talk. And also he gets to be a part of investing and deploying some of his capital into the Gaza plan. So this is all about financial negotiations and then pretending you're rescuing hostages and creating atrocity propaganda when there was no sexual violence on October the 7th. All they used, the UN report said, it was just the positioning of the bodies was the only evidence. And there was Hannibal Directive, where Israel actually fired Apache helicopters and flamethrowers that led to much of the death and destruction. Obviously, there were deaths. This was an operation. It was a hostage swap operation, but there was no beheaded babies. There was none of that stuff. And they're still using that propaganda in order to try and radicalize evangelical Christians and Americans into believing that they are the good people, but they're discovering all of these scams and all of these operations and Epstein and everything. And now they're really manufacturing civil unrest so that they can implement all these digital ID and technology that they beta tested in Gaza and Ukraine. And Gaza becomes the model for what the US Proof of Weapons Network wants to do. Now, the GCC and Egypt have submitted a counter plan, and it is radically different. But now we're entering into that negotiation. And all of the narrative from Trump is that I think we can do a Gaza deal, and we're going to get the hostages back. So you get all of this theater to just not expose how the US dollar proof of weapons network works. And finally, as America goes back into a regional power, the truth comes out, and more of the real history book is going to be written without this propaganda campaign of defending democracy. Okay, so I just wanted to add some of that color, and let's see where Trump goes next.
Done. We have to stop the war in Gaza immediately. We have to stop it. We have to get it done. We have to negotiate. Immediately have to negotiate peace. We got to get the hostages back. We want all 20 back. We don't want 2 and 4. As you know, I got, along with Steve Witkoff and others that helped us, Marco Rubio, we got most of them back. We were involved in all of them. But I always said the last 20 are going to be the hardest, and that's exactly what happened. We have to get them back now. We don't want to get back 2, and then another 2, and then 1, and then 3. Have this process. No, we want them all back, and we want the actually 38 dead bodies back too. Those parents came to me, and they want them back, and they want them back very quickly and very badly, as though they were alive. They want them. They want them every bit as much as if their son or daughter were alive. I've also been working relentlessly, stopping the killing in Ukraine. I thought that would be, of the 7 wars that I stopped, I thought that would be the easiest because of my relationship with President Putin, which had always been a good one. I thought that was going to be the easiest one. But in war, you never know what's going to happen. There are always lots of surprises, both good and bad. Everyone thought Russia would win this war in 3 days, but it didn't work out that way. It was supposed to be just a quick little skirmish. It's not making Russia look good. It's making them look bad. No matter what happens from here on out, this was something that should have taken a matter of days, certainly less than a week. And they've been fighting for 3.5 years and killing anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 young soldiers, mostly soldiers, on both sides, every single week. from 5 to 7,000 dead young people, and some in cities, much smaller numbers, where rockets are shot, where drones are dropped. This war would never have started if I were president. This was a war that should have never happened. It shows you what leadership is, what bad leadership can do to a country. Look what happened to the United States, and look where we are right now in just a short period of time. The only question now is how many more lives will be needlessly lost on both sides. China and India are the primary funders of the ongoing war by continuing to purchase Russian oil. But inexcusably, even NATO countries have not cut off much Russian energy and Russian energy products, which, as you know, I found out about 2 weeks ago, and I wasn't happy. Think of it. They're funding the war against themselves. Who the hell ever heard of that one? In the event that Russia is not ready to make a deal to end the war, then the United States is fully prepared to impose a very strong round of powerful tariffs, which would stop the bloodshed, I believe, very quickly. But for those tariffs to be effective, European nations, all of you are gathered here right now, would have to join us in adopting the exact same measures. I mean, you're much closer to this. We have an ocean in between. You're right there. And Europe has to step it up. They can't be doing what they're doing. They're buying oil and gas from Russia while they're fighting Russia. It's embarrassing to them, and it was very embarrassing to them when I found out about it, I can tell you that. But they have to immediately cease all energy purchases from Russia. Otherwise, we're all wasting a lot of time. So I'm ready to discuss this. We're going to discuss it today with the European nations, all gathered here. I'm sure they're thrilled to hear me speak about it, but that's the way it is. I like to speak my mind and speak the truth. As we seek to reduce the threat of dangerous weapons today, I'm also calling on every nation to join us in ending the development of biological weapons once and for all. And biological is terrible, and nuclear is even beyond, and we include nuclear in that. We want to have a cessation of the development of nuclear weapons. We know, and I get to view it all the time. Sir, would you like to see? And I look at weapons that are so powerful that we just can't ever use them. If we ever use them, the world literally might come to an end. There would be no United Nations to be talking about. There would be no nothing. Just a few years ago, reckless experiments overseas gave us a devastating global pandemic. Yet despite that worldwide catastrophe, many countries are continuing extremely risky research into bioweapons and man-made pathogens. This is unbelievably dangerous. To prevent potential disasters, I'm announcing today that my administration will lead an international effort to enforce biological weapons convention, which is going to be meeting with the top leaders of the world by pioneering an AI verification system that everyone can trust. Hopefully the UN can play a constructive role.
Before we jump into AI, let's break down some of those stories. So remember, every accusation is a confession here. And so that has always been the playbook. It is, always create a boogie monster enemy and blame the others for what you're doing. And that's been the playbook. That's why people are so gaslit by what Israel does. Israel is just a more extreme, lawless version of American policy. And how this proof of weapon network works. So let's just go through a few things. He mentioned Steve Witkoff, the envoy to the Middle East. So Steve Witkoff is a shareholder in World Liberty Financial. He was also one of the backers of Urban Movers Limited. Urban Movers, if you look at the FBI files on 9/11, was the Mossad van that had explosives in it. And it was connected to those that were the Mossad operations that knew about 9/11 before it happened. They detained what was called the dancing Israelis that were celebrating, and they said on national TV that they were there to film and they knew about the operation before it was going to happen. And so Steve Witkoff was somebody that's connected to that operation. Later this year, there's going to be a film on 9/11 that I'm looking forward to bringing to people, because there's so much crazy stuff out there. I wanted to make sure that I can recommend that to you. Ryan Dawson's working on that one. Right. So Steve Witkoff is also a shareholder in World Liberty Financial. World Liberty Financial is Trump's crypto company that has essentially launched a stablecoin that is doing these deals between the Middle East and crypto in order to build this Orwellian programmable money that can benefit from the interest on all of the US national debt. So the way a stablecoin works, if you're a long-term listener of Bitcoin Hard Talk, somebody deposits $1, you create a digital representation on a shitcoin blockchain, something else that's not Bitcoin. And then you take that dollar and you lend it to the US government and you receive the yield on that. You can then take that yield and you can buy Bitcoin. And so the largest stablecoin, or collectively, there's about $250 billion. Now, Trump started doing deals with the Middle Eastern Gulf funds in order to facilitate investments. And then they would put the dollar, they would launch a stable coin. And then they would, and then the Trump family, through Steve Witkoff partnership and his son's partnership, would receive the yield on the US debt. And, you know, you can, at the moment, I think there's about $2 billion of market cap. Steve Witkoff was also the only person that was there during the 2 assassination attempts at Trump. And obviously Netanyahu blamed that on Iran, and still to this day says that Iran tried to assassinate him, despite anyone that's looked into that. This was a time when they were saying that Iranian flying saucers and UFOs are coming over the border, and Hamas and ISIS are coming in at the same time, while they were building the border artificial intelligence powered by Palantir technology that they were beta testing around the world, and that they're now using on the British and American people. So anyway, World Liberty Financial and Steve Witkoff is negotiating as envoy to the Middle East for Trump these quote unquote peace deals, which is essentially the mafia saying, how much are you going to give us in foreign direct investment for BlackRock portfolio companies so that the banks can invest rather than us profiting from the forever war, on the condition that we're able to make up that money somewhere else. Where are they making up that money? Of course, Trump goes and negotiates for Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, and Raytheon over to NATO, that is now European after the European Union, that was created by the Bank for International Settlements, the organization that funded the CIA and Nazi Germany during World War I, World War II, that also is the shareholder of all the central banks for this organization. They create the European Union. European Union now creates the euro. The euro vassalizes the whole of Europe into the euro. And in October, they launch a central bank digital currency that will be integrated into a digital ID that requires Palantir and all the various other technology in order to build this elaborate network. So once you've vassalized Europe, shut off its cheap natural gas by installing Zelensky, funding a colored revolution in Ukraine in 2014, and expanding NATO beyond the fall of the Berlin Wall agreement that required no NATO expansion closer to Russia, then obviously you end up with a war. You get to sacrifice Europe. And then when you fire all those sanctions, you're sanctioning Europe. Why? Because America, it created fracking and now can export its gas and export its oil. And it wants Europe to pay for it so that it can become a regional power, and BlackRock can acquire all the European assets, all the UK assets, build out its AI data centers, acquire water, build tokenization, central bank digital currencies, digital ID, artificial intelligence, Orwellian nightmare, so that they can demonstrate that they can control the population, test it with open border, closed border, civil unrest, pay for people like Tommy Robinson and Elon Musk to rifle up tensions, pull out old controversies like grooming gangs and various other things, create religious and racial tensions, create more wars so that you can then have more refugees and immigrants, and then you weaponize the whole thing to get your technology through, which goes back to the US proof of weapons network. And this is part of its regional power plan. Of course, those companies need rare earth minerals. So Trump negotiates, I want to create peace. I'm going to end the war. And Ukraine says, well, we'll take some of your money that you steal from the American people through inflation. We'll take a cut. We'll spend it back in Lockheed Martin and General Dynamic. But now you need to get NATO to pay for it. So the European Union and the European Central Bank have a White House theater where Trump and Zelensky pretend they're getting a divorce. And then suddenly Zelensky turns up with Keir Starmer and Macron and the other different installed politicians. And they say, we're now going to spend 5% of our budget and we'll spend it with you, America, and you, BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network. But we need you to keep funding USAID and media to make people think that we're defending democracy and Putin is about to take over the world. And we need you to keep that narrative. There's at least $1 trillion of revenue that we can steal from the K-shaped economy. And then you can have the Nobel Peace Prize, Trump, if you pretend that you're negotiating peace when you're really negotiating contracts for the Proof of Weapons Network. But we need to pretend that the Russian economy is about to collapse, despite the fact that the debt to GDP of Russia has now gone down to 14%. It has rebuilt its internal economy. Yes, it has inflation, but because it has its own central bank and it has its own resources, and it kicked out the American Proof of Weapons Network after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Putin became public enemy number one, and they painted him as Hitler, even though I think, it's not someone I'm, a fan of. I don't really care, but just follow the money and understand it. When he kicked out those that want to securitize and financialize all of the resources in Russia, just like they tried to do in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution and installed the Communist Party in the first place, when they tried to securitize and financialize, Putin resisted, arrested all of the oligarch billionaires, and then obviously this became part of the next operation. So that drove Russia closer to China, which created BRICS, which was Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is a part of the Proof of Weapons Network that doesn't have an America First agenda anymore, which is why they installed Trump in order to have the tariff policy to reset the world order into a multipolar order. Now, what do you need to do to weaken the dollar? Well, you need to demonstrate strategically by BlackRock and by the Proof of Weapons Network and by the global banks and technical industrial complex that propping up the dollar and sanctions no longer work. So you take the countries, Russia, the most sanctioned in the world, and Iran, the most sanctioned in the world. You say when they're using nuclear energy, they're trying to blow us up and take over the world. Russia is Hitler. He wants to blow us up and take over the world. And therefore, we can sell more weapons. But what do? They align with China. China builds its manufacturing base. China doesn't have oil. And China is investing in renewable energy to make up the fact that it doesn't have oil, but it purchases it from Iran and Russia, and the Shanghai Proof of Weapons Network evolves. I covered that in other broadcasts. And so now China is proving that the dollar can't sanction. And oil still flows in this network, and they're building alternative payment rails so that all the financial weapons of mass destruction no longer work. And then what did BRICS do? Partnered with GCC. Israel can no longer be a tool for the military industrial complex. BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network come in and say, okay, let's discuss rebuild and financialization. And then, but we need to keep this war in Ukraine and Russia and that racket going for a bit longer. We get more assets across Europe. We get to profit from killing Ukrainians and Russians. And America gets some more rare earth minerals, and we get to pretend that we're negotiating peace. Also, we can make sure that Europe is dependent upon American oil and gas as well. And maybe we can get some more leverage over the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund that in defense decided to boycott against Israeli investments and has been divesting. And so now we've got partnerships that are happening outside of our sphere of influence. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan decide to sign an agreement, a nuclear power and a a surplus sovereign country. Now we need to care about nuclear denuclearization. It's not going to happen. But anyway, we need to look like we care about peace and we care about life. And that we actually care about things like pandemics. And we've already had the Fauci investigations. We already know who benefited from, the Wuhan bioweapon. And we already know that helped Moderna and the pump and dump schemes of all these American companies. And we already knew that the CIA was funding the Wuhan labs. All of this was covered in the Senate hearings where Fauci had to answer to all those questions. And we just kind of pretend, that was just the corrupt lefties. That was Biden. And you go through this radical left, radical right merry-go-round of distraction, knowing that this benefited consolidation and shutting down of all the small businesses into the proof of weapons network. So you had global financial crisis, socialized losses, privatized gains, create the proof of weapons network to the next stage of power above governments. Then you had shutdown, lockdowns, and pandemics. That vassalizes all of the small business into large. You then have the escalation and inflationary spiral as a result of the Ukrainian and Russian escalation, bailing out a bank, saving the banks, further consolidation of power, the K-shaped economy, indebting and enslaving those that don't hold the assets, further concentration of shareholder value, and then you do tariffs in order to do the same thing. Now we're at the stage where you can allow people a little bit of freedom of speech so that we can build their social credit score, but we don't want to give them freedom of reach because we want to control certain narratives, and we give them an absolute spaghetti junction. And if you haven't watched my 5-part video series called Mind Control or Mind Wars, I went through in 5 blogs all the different types of operations and how to protect yourself. Just go to the blog. It's completely open source. You can watch videos, TLDRs, and various other things. But the point is, now we care about bioweapons. Now we care about all these different things. Now we care about nuclear weapons. Now that the proof of weapons network wants a multipolar world order, and Trump is pretending that this is all about MAGA, because the proof of weapons network is taking the same colonial tactics and bringing them home and doing them on their own people. Let's go to the next part of the speech.
One of the early projects under AI. Let's see how good it is, because a lot of people are saying it could be one of the great things ever, but it also can be dangerous, but it can be put to tremendous use and tremendous good, and this would be an example of that. Not only is the UN not solving the problems it should, too often, it's actually creating new problems for us to solve. The best example is the #1 political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. It's uncontrolled. Your countries are being ruined. The United Nations is funding an assault on Western countries and their borders. In 2024, the UN budgeted $372 million in cash assistance to support an estimated 624,000 migrants journeying into the United States. Think of that. The UN is supporting people that are illegally coming into the United States, and then we have to get them out. The UN also provided food, shelter, transportation, and debit cards to illegal aliens. Can you believe that? On the way to infiltrate our southern border. Millions of people came through that southern border. Just a year ago, millions and millions of people were pouring in, 25 million altogether over the 4 years of the incompetent Biden administration. And now we have it stopped, totally stopped. In fact, they're not even coming anymore because they know they can't get through. But what took place is totally unacceptable. The UN is supposed to stop invasions, not create them and not finance them. In the United States, we reject the idea that mass numbers of people from foreign lands can be permitted to travel halfway around the world, trample our borders, violate our sovereignty, cause unmitigated crime, and deplete our social safety net. we have reasserted that America belongs to the American people, and I encourage all countries to take their own stand in defense of their citizens as well. You have to do that because I see it. I'm not mentioning names. I see it, and I can call every single one of them out. You're destroying your countries. They're being destroyed. Europe is in serious trouble. They've been invaded by a force of illegal aliens like nobody's ever seen before. Illegal aliens are pouring into Europe. Nobody is ever, and nobody's doing anything to change it, to get them out. It's not sustainable. And because they choose to be politically correct, they're doing just absolutely nothing about it. And I have to say, I look at London, where you have a terrible mayor, terrible, terrible mayor, and it's been so changed, so changed. Now they want to go to Sharia law, but you're in a different country. You can't do that. Both the immigration and their suicidal energy ideas will be the death of Western Europe if something is not done immediately. This cannot be sustained. What makes the world so beautiful is that each country is unique. But to stay this way, every sovereign nation must have the right to control their own borders. You have the right to control your borders, as we do now, and to limit the sheer numbers of migrants entering their countries and paid for by the people of that nation that were there and that built that particular nation at the time. They put their blood, sweat, tears, money into that country, and now they're being ruined. Proud nations must be allowed to protect their communities and prevent their societies from being overwhelmed by people they have never seen before, with different customs, religions, with different everything. Where migrants have violated laws, lodged false asylum claims, or claimed refugee status for illegitimate reasons, they should, in many cases, be immediately sent home. And while we will always have a big heart for places and people that are struggling and truly compassionate, answers will be given. We have to solve the problem, and we have to solve it in their countries, not create new problems in our countries. And we are very helpful to a lot of countries that are just not able to send their people anymore. They used to send them to us in caravans of 25,000, 30,000 people each. These massive caravans of people pouring into our country, totally unchecked and unvetted. But not anymore. According to the Council of Europe in 2024, almost 50% of inmates in German prisons were foreign nationals or migrants. In Austria, the number was 53% of the people in prisons were from places that weren't from where they are now. In Greece, the number was 54%, and in Switzerland, beautiful Switzerland, 72% of the people in prisons are from outside of Switzerland. When your prisons are filled with so-called asylum seekers who repaid kindness, and that's what they did, they repaid kindness with crime, it's time to end the failed experiment of open borders. You have to end it now. See, I can tell you, I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell. In America, we've taken bold action to swiftly shut down uncontrolled migration. Once we started detaining and deporting everyone who crossed the border and removing illegal aliens from the United States, they simply stopped coming. They're not coming anymore. We're getting a lot of credit, but they're not coming anymore. This was a humanitarian act for all involved, because on the trips up, thousands of people a week were dying. Women were being raped. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. Raped, horribly beaten, raped. On the trip up, the journey up, it was a long walk. It was a long, arduous journey, indeed. And it was also a historic victory against human trafficking throughout the region. What we did was a victory, and we saved so many lives of people that wouldn't make the journey. That journey was loaded up with death. Loaded up with death. Dead bodies all along the roads of jungles to get up. They go through jungles, they go through areas so hot you couldn't breathe. They were dying of suffocation, areas so hot that you couldn't breathe. Dead bodies all over. By them not coming, we're saving tremendous numbers of lives. My people have done a fantastic job in doing what they did, and the American public agrees with it. I mean, I was very proud to see this morning I have the highest poll numbers I've ever had. Part of it is because of what we've done on the border. I guess the other part is what we've done on the economy. Joe Biden's policies empowered murderous gangs, human smugglers, child traffickers, drug cartels, and prisoners from all over the world. The previous administration also lost nearly 300,000 children. Think of that. They lost more than 300,000 children, little children, who were trafficked into the United States.
Okay, let's cover a bit of this. So we already knew, if you've been watching from the beginning, that it was the CIA operations, a black op operation that creates all these drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking, and various other operations. So Trump knows, as well as anybody else knows, that is in a position of power, that these are operations that are systemically part of the proof of weapons network and propping up the dollar in the debt-based Ponzi scheme. So what you're witnessing is essentially what happened on October the 7th, which is atrocity propaganda. Atrocity propaganda is a technique used by Operation Mockingbird and previous operations. This is where you create a religious justification, often, in order to recruit an army so that the military can engage in their settler colonial expeditions. And you need to create rage and use the worst parts of human society, like sexual violence and various other things, in order to enrage people to want to fight for that, or create civil unrest in order to achieve a goal. And so these types of psyops, for example, Operation Mockingbird, where the media would be taken over by CIA operatives. And this is why you get to spread all of this type of propaganda. October the 7th was the perfect type of operation. Radicalize Zionists, both evangelical Christians and Jews and atheists and ordinary people, into thinking that what you created on October the 7th in order to, on 9/11, in order to justify the wars that you profited from, that you create this, that this is some kind of Muslim invasion. So if you haven't watched my 5-part video series on the Muslim invasion, and also the other side of that, i.e. the Jews rule the world conspiracy theory, and how that is weaponized as a tool of the proof of weapons network. And so you can create these two strategic tension sides, just like you had with the communist capitalists, you know, the fascist Hitler side, and you have with the radical left and the Nazi far right, and all of these different things that you do in order to get the desired outcome so that you can implement your solution. And so atrocity propaganda is used, and Trump is using that in full force because he knows what the solution is. The solution is a command and control surveillance state and police state, because he knows that the biggest enemy to these corporations and to the power class is the actual people finding out what is happening. And so at this stage of the game, you want to build Palantir, digital IDs, central bank digital currencies to create financial weapons of mass destruction and surveillance weapons of mass destruction. So you can move to pre-crime agenda, because you know that the artificial intelligence and robotics is going to be used in the West, because you're making up for the revenue lost from all the death, murder, destruction, and atrocity the dollar and the pound and the British and American empire inflicted upon the world for decades and decades. And so he needs to scare the hell out of you into believing that he's trying to solve you from the problem that was created. And lo and behold, we get the solution, which is the Palantir technology that has been tested, funded by CIA, Silicon Valley, Peter Thiel, Jeffrey Epstein, funded. And when he starts talking about, you know, children's sexual violence, he also knows that he's engaged in a cover-up operation for the Epstein files as well. So this is about gaslighting, narrative, and just really getting to that extreme part of the K-shaped economy. He also knows that migration is allowed, and he is part of the close, command and control, police state, surveillance state side of the operation. He can blame the other side of the operation on Biden, but this is, simply part of the military industrial complex, technical industrial complex, financial industrial complex, proof of weapons network to prop up the dollar. And he knows that because the media and the Department of Government Efficiency revealed that the National Endowment of Democracy and USAID were funding the media and all these transgender types of propaganda and climate change and ISIS and Al-Qaeda training camps and all of those covert operations, and the Ukrainian media and the BBC and various other things, because that was all revealed by the AI in the Department of Government Efficiency as well. So, and we knew that if you're a Bitcoiner, you were following WikiLeaks, and we learned all these different things through leaked documents, which is why Keir Starmer tried to pin sexual crimes on Julian Assange, and he only just got out from those crimes as well after WikiLeaks, the actual media, where whistleblowers can share documents without the oversight of the CIA, was obviously funded by Bitcoin as well. So immigration and migration is created from all of the wars that propped up the proof of weapons network. And so when you make your country unlivable through financial weapons of mass destruction, covert regime changes, the hundreds, just read the book, Covert Regime Change, and you'll see all of the declassified operations. Read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, the IMF operations. Read these different books, and you'll see from people that were doing those operations what they were doing. Because destroy a country economically for safety, create poverty, then you end up with refugees that you can weaponize in order to change and destabilize countries. And you know how to solve the migration crisis. You allow countries to be freed from the dollar in order to rebuild their countries and actually use their resources and actually have some kind of prosperity. But America never wanted such competition because it created that debt-based Ponzi scheme with the Federal Reserve as well. And so everything about democracy, about all of these different things, all a complete fabrication, because at the moment, the US belongs to the proof of weapons network. So this is, all of this are US operations. And so he then gaslits the European Union, talking about the European invasion, knowing that this was a covert operation of the proof of weapons network and the deep state that sits under the military industrial complex. And the people in the room know that. And the only ones that are the leaders in Europe are the ones that have been installed and are serving the same lobby agenda. And so once you know this, the sheer comedy of thinking that Trump is an anomaly that's coming against the establishment, you just have to follow the money and understand systemically how this works. Now, Trump could have been replaced by anybody else. This isn't Trump derangement syndrome. This is systemic, and he was installed. The presidents are not elected, they are selected. And media gives them all the tools. You can decide when to do the vote rigging or not. And we know all the different violence is the tool to get and service what they want. And if you think that this is a conspiracy theory, you just have to ask yourself, so this stateless entity that used to be connected with the US empire and the British empire has been doing this for decades and decades and decades. They know that sexual violence, I've seen them on WikiLeaks, is a tool that they've used on the global south throughout time. When you have these lawless operations, they go and take the women. They do what they want. Like, this is all documented, crimes against humanity to prop up the dollar. Like, you know, and all of these types of things that they're saying are the very same things that happen from the US side, the European side, the British side in these wars and radicalization exercises. And they need you to believe that it's them. And we're not doing that. But we're actually moving to an environment where everyone that's sat in that room will know what these operations are. So, you know, this is pure theatrics for MAGA, for the Europeans, to believe that they're actually care for you and they're actually going to try and fix some of these things. Now, I know that it's a big black pill, but without truth, there is no peace. And so when we get to solutions, you know, I just need you to understand through real world how much they lie to you, because for some reason, people think like Trump is coming after the system and he's not lying. This is the system. And this is the system that is being pushed back right now only because competing systems have emerged, because, you know, this national proof of weapons network doesn't care about the West anymore. It just needs the US capital markets, and it will use the dollar until it's no longer useful. Okay, let's go to the next section.
Raped, exploited, and abused, and sold. Sold. Nobody talks about that. The fake news doesn't write about it. With many others, young children who are missing or dead. And we found a lot of these children, and we're sending them back, and we've been sending them back to their parents. They said, nobody knows who they are. They said, where do you come from? And they'll give us a country, and we'll find out, and we'll figure it out, and we'll bring them back to their homes. And the mother and father rush to the door, and their tears in their eyes. They can't believe that they're seeing their son or daughter, their little son or daughter again. We've done almost 30,000 of them so far. Any system that results in the mass trafficking of children is inherently evil. Yet that is exactly what the globalist migration agenda has done, and it's what it's all about. In America, those days, as you know, are over. The Trump administration is working, and we are continuing to work to track down the villains that are causing this problem, and also, as I said, to get back the 30,000 we've already returned. Now I think we're going to have another. We're going to find a lot. You're not going to find all of them. 300, more than 300,000. They're lost or they're dead. They're lost or they're dead because of the animals that did this. To protect our citizens, I've also designated multiple savage drug cartels as far as and you see this, and you see it happening right before your eyes. Let's put it this way. People don't like taking big loads of drugs in boats anymore. There aren't too many boats that are traveling on the seas by Venezuela. They tend not to want to travel very quickly anymore. And we've virtually stopped drugs coming into our country by sea. We call them the water drugs. They kill hundreds of thousands of people. I've also designated multiple savage drug cartels as far as foreign terrorist organizations, along with two bloodthirsty transnational gangs, probably the worst gangs anywhere in the world, MS-13 and Tren de Aragua. Tren de Aragua is from Venezuela, by the way. Such organizations torture, maim, mutilate, and murder with impunity. They're the enemies of all humanity. And for this reason, we've recently begun using the supreme power of the United States military to destroy Venezuelan terrorists and trafficking networks led by Nicolas Maduro. To every terrorist thug smuggling poisonous drugs into the United States of America, please be warned that we will blow you out of existence. That's what we're doing. We have no choice. Can't let it happen. They're destroying. I believe we lost 300,000 people last year to drugs, 300,000. Fentanyl and other drugs. Each boat that we sink carries drugs that would kill more than 25,000 Americans. We will not let that happen. Energy is another area where the United States is now thriving like never before. We're getting rid of the falsely named renewables. By the way, they're a joke. They don't work. They're too expensive. They're not strong enough to fire up the plants that you need to make your country great.
Okay, just before we go into renewables, because that's another tangent, I just want to comment on a few more of these things. So obviously, this is atrocity propaganda at the highest level. Whoever wrote the script for Trump to read out is ratcheting up the proof of weapons network solutions. So once you've established all of the problems, which is things that society has agreed are crimes against humanity and awful, that are created by the proof of weapons network, that are engineered and weaponized as a tool, you get to use that fear in order to come back with your solution, your digital ID, your removal of the First Amendment, in order to wind people up. And then they pull out their Second Amendment. And guess what? You're going to be shooting into Palantir, which is a AI surveillance tool that's been tested around the world that is coming home. And so you need to ratchet up the fear a little bit more, just so you know. M13, another one that was a covert operation by the US into El Salvador in order to completely destroy that Latin American economy. It's now fighting back with Bitcoin, but it can't because IMF is trying to interfere at the moment. But the gangs that were created in M13 led to the creation of this privatized prison industry that was used in order to take the highest homicide rates in Latin America in El Salvador, after America's covert operations to destroy the country, to prop up the dollar and gain access to resources. He was able to put them in prison, and that created a new industry where Americans that now have core GEO Group, and I've forgotten the name of the company now, Core Cover, I think it was. These are the privatized prison industry that sponsors through the lobbies ICE, for example, which is like martial law, federal level policing that are being deployed all across the country. And in order to do that, so that with every deportation, it is revenue stream. With every person you put in prison, America has the highest incarceration rates in the world. That is a revenue stream for this privatized prison industry. And these M13s, which are partners with, the CIA or whichever type of route, now that was not needed in the El Salvador routes anymore. But these groups are all used to manufacture the fear, to push through the routes that the CIA uses in order to prop up the dollar and steal money from the American people over to the American corporation. And all of this narrative is perpetuating the very same financial goals when you follow the money as well. Because the military is now coming inwards, it's coming home, it's cannibalizing itself in order to make up for the lost revenue because it can't destroy other countries anymore. And now we need to understand the renewable climate change side. So let's go into Trump, and then I'll help you follow the money and understand what's going on there.
Mills are so pathetic and so bad, so expensive to operate. Then they have to be rebuilt all the time, and they start to rust and rot. Most expensive energy ever conceived, and it's actually energy. You're supposed to make money with energy, not lose money. You lose money, the governments have to subsidize. You can't put them out without massive subsidies. And most of them are built in China, and I give China a lot of credit. They build them, but they very few wind farms. So why is it that they build them and they send them all over the world, but they barely use them? You know what they use? Coal. They use gas. They use almost anything, but they don't like wind. But they sure as hell like selling the windmills. Europe, on the other hand, has a long way to go, with many countries being on the brink of destruction because of the green energy agenda. And I give a lot of credit to Germany. Germany was being led down a very sick path, both on immigration, by the way, and on energy. They were going green, and they were going bankrupt. And the new leadership New leadership came in and they went back to where they were with fossil fuel and with nuclear, which is good. It's now safe, and you can do it properly. But they went back to where they were, and they opened up a lot of different plants, energy-producing plants, and they're doing well. I give Germany a lot of credit for that. They've said this is a disaster, what's happening. They were going all green. All green is all bankrupt. That's what it represents. And it's not politically correct. I'll be very badly criticized for saying it, but I'm here to tell the truth. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. I'm in New York City. I'm feeling a lot safer. Crime, we're getting crime down. And by the way, speaking of crime, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was the crime capital of America. Now it's a totally, after 12 days, it's a totally safe city. Everyone's going out to dinner. They're going out to restaurants. Your wife can walk down the middle of the street with or without you. Nothing's going to happen. My people have done a fantastic job. And yes, I called in the National Guard, and the National Guard took care of business, and they weren't politically correct, but they took care of business. We got 1,700 career criminals out, brought them back to where they came from, the countries where they came from, or put them in jails. Washington, D.C. is now a totally safe city again, and I welcome you to come. In fact, we'll have dinner together at a local restaurant, and we'll be able to walk. We don't have to go by an armor-plated vehicle. We'll walk right over there from the White House. They've given up their powerful edge, a lot of the countries that we're talking about, in oil and gas, such as essentially closing the great North Sea oil. Oh, the North Sea, I know it so well. Aberdeen was the oil capital of Europe, and there's tremendous oil that hasn't been found in the North Sea. Tremendous oil. And I was with the Prime Minister I respect and like a lot, and I said, you're sitting with the greatest asset. They essentially closed it by making it so highly taxed that no developer, no oil company can go there. They have tremendous oil left, and more importantly, they have tremendous oil that hasn't even been found yet. And what a tremendous asset for the United Kingdom. And I hope the Prime Minister is listening, because I told it to him 3 days in a row. That's all he heard. North Sea oil, North Sea, because I want to see them do well. I want to stop seeing them ruining that beautiful Scottish and English countryside with windmills and massive solar panels that go 7 miles by 7 miles, taking away farmland. But we're not letting this happen in America. In 1982, the executive director of the United Nations Environmental Program predicted that by the year 2000, climate change would cause a global catastrophe. He said that it will be irreversible, as any nuclear holocaust would be. This is what they said at the United Nations. What happened? Here we are. Another UN official stated in 1989 that within a decade, entire nations could be wiped off the map by global warming. Not happening. You know, it used to be global cooling. If you look back years ago in the 1920s and the 1930s, they said, global cooling will kill the world. We have to do something. Then they said global warming will kill the world, but then it started getting cooler, so now they could just call it climate change, because that way they can't miss. It's climate change, because if it goes higher or lower, whatever the hell happens, there's climate change. It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion. Climate change, no matter what happens, you're involved in that. No more global warming, no more global cooling. All of these predictions made by the United Nations and many others, often for bad reasons, were wrong. They were made by stupid people that have cost their countries fortunes and given those same countries no chance for success. If you don't get away from this green scam, your country is going to fail. And I'm really good at predicting things, you know. They actually said during the campaign they had a hat, the best-selling hat. Trump was right about everything. And I don't say that in a braggadocious way, but it's true. I've been right about everything. And I'm telling you that if you don't get away from the green energy scam, your country is going to fail. And if you don't stop people that you've never seen before, that you have nothing in common with, your country is going to fail. I'm the president of the United States, but I worry about Europe. I love Europe. I love the people of Europe. And I hate to see it being devastated by energy and immigration. This double-tailed monster destroys everything in its wake, and they cannot let that happen any longer. You're doing it because you want to be nice. You want to be politically correct, and you're destroying your heritage. They must take control.
Okay, so this is how the proof of weapons network, radicalizes both on the left, right, and right side. Democrat, Republican. So there have been clear operations funded by USAID and various other organizations in order to push out the narrative. So the financial industrial complex, part of the proof of weapons network, is able to redeploy capital in order to manipulate markets and move the different types of flows where BlackRock and the proof of weapons network and various other organizations want it to go. And both the left and the right, they play completely up into the narrative. Obviously, you have what Trump would call the radical left. They play right into the climate change narrative. And then the right would play into the oil narrative. The whole point here is that they have the solutions, they have the market manipulations. And the reason why America turns over its president, where you have to go into the next phase of election every 2 years, is because the president's not in charge. And so it's very easy, Trump, to say that you predict everything correctly. Firstly, you say everything, and then you just pick what you say correctly. But it's very easy to predict things correctly when you are a tool of the financial industrial complex, which is able to use JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and various other institutions to securitize, financialize, and move markets in the direction that is needed to optimize the portfolio of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. So everything that we are seeing right now is actually about the vast amount of energy that is needed to power in this artificial intelligence that is going to be resetting absolutely everything globally. And there isn't enough energy in the world to power the vast amount of energy that is needed for all of this artificial intelligence. So you need to turn countries into data centers. You need to turn water, AI and energy requires a lot of water cooling. And you need to power the right type of energy. But if somebody can create very cheap energy through renewables, what does that do to the other energy providers that are relying upon selling that expensive energy? So this is the tension. And an asset manager at the proof of weapons network like BlackRock would use ESG, environmental social governance, in order to reset the world order and tokenize energy, securitize and financialize, give everyone carbon credit scores. And this is Elon Musk's kind of whole play. He was a part of that. The PayPal mafia, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, they both get to play their role. Peter Thiel gets the Palantir side, and Elon Musk gets the electricity side. Sure that all of that backdoor data is going in, and from both of them, into the artificial intelligence. Who else was in the PayPal mafia? David Sachs. David Sachs, who worked at the White House on the AI and crypto strategy and recently left in order to join the board of Tether as they launch their programmatic stablecoin compliant with Genius Act. And Genius Act was introduced using the bait, the carrot of Bitcoin strategic reserves, and then you just implement the stick of stablecoin technocratic programmable money to prop up the dollar and the proof of weapons network. But everybody that, like Trump and his family through World Liberty Financial, they get to have a stablecoin, as does JP Morgan and the financial industrial complex, lending Elon Musk the money to borrow against his Tesla stock, which can be artificially pumped up by government and Pentagon budgets so that it can acquire X from somebody that might not be pushing the full process of the back door of the social credit score, because that person, Jack Dorsey, is now focusing on Bitcoin and sovereign and self-custody and nodes and various other things. Look, say what you want about that, but there is a struggle at the top of the proof of weapons network because these different complexes, they screw each other and shaft each other, but they all work for the financial industrial complex because they can destroy your share price, reflow capital, ruin bond markets, capital markets, and reset the world order, because America allowed and Britain allowed for this monster to be created that now owns all the politicians and all the government. So Trump gets to push that narrative when everybody knows that they're working to whoever they're paid for by the lobby. So once you have the ability to reset capital flows through narrative like ESG, control of media in order to radicalize people into climate change, non-climate change, then Trump can just say, this is a scam. Biden can say, we've got to focus on clean energy. And you get both sides in order to execute the operation. Now, what's really happening? Well, China is not an oil producer. And it is relies upon, it's now built the largest oil reserves by purchasing it from Iran and Russia, which has created that alternative network. China wants every form of energy, and it might be creating solar energy, wind energy, and all the other forms of energy. But that might make artificial intelligence from China significantly more competitive and cheaper relative to playing all these different power plays, because the largest purchaser of oil from Saudi Arabia is now China, the largest purchaser from Russia. And why Venezuela? Venezuela, which is next to Guyana. And why does he start talking about Brazil later as well? We won't get to that, because these are all the largest pools of oil, as is Argentina, which has now done an elaborate pump and dump scheme for the proof of weapons network, sent all its gold to Rothschilds in London while stealing more money after the IMF economic hitmen in Argentina stole vast wealth and turned a country that was utilizing its oil into an absolute nightmare. And now Milei gets to use that pump and dump bond scheme now to service the proof of weapons network. And you're seeing now that Venezuela, suddenly we care about drugs. So they're ratcheting up the... But Guyana, which is next to Venezuela, and by the way, I'm not talking about these leaders. These could be evil, evil leaders. But what is happening with Venezuela? Well, they're purchasing drones from Iran, and they're in the Belt and Road Initiative. And who controls the oil? Who says whether it can happen or not? Chevron and Exxon, two nodes of the proof of weapons network, to prop up the dollar as well. So we're led to believe, while the CIA allows all the drug trafficking operations and they have all their routes and partnership, that Trump now wants to tackle drugs. So it starts ratcheting up narrative around its neighbors in Latin America, South America, when the military is exiting other regions and needs to make up for lost profit in these regions so they can repeat the whole exercise. So China's creating those energy sources, which is problematic. And that is what's changing here. So POW is partnering with different countries because America is no longer useful in that equation because it doesn't have the manufacturing base. Guyana has the largest oil discovery. Chevron is part of those transactions. Venezuela says we're going to start working with Guyana over that border dispute. So you have Iran there, you have China side there, and you have Chevron and border disputes. Suddenly we care about drugs. No, this is the old tactics that are coming back to Latin America. And sadly, if you are a neighbor of America, you're the new target. And so China's got that whole thing going on. ESG is the narrative in order to reset capital flows. When the proof of weapons network wants to change those capital flows, they can just switch who they're investing in. And what did they do to Europe? Well, Germany had nuclear energy. Now, why was nuclear energy switched off at the same time as CIA bombing Nord Stream pipeline, because that was about weakening the manufacturing base and deindustrializing Germany, which is basically the largest node in the European Union, in order to completely vassalize Europe to prop up the GDP of the debt-based Ponzi scheme from the dollar through the euro-dollar markets. And then you can start pushing out those additional sales through the technical industrial complex and refinance those countries, which is why they engineered the Ukrainian war, and they're sacrificing Ukrainian, and Trump's pretending that he cares about life. Now, if Germany switches back on its nuclear, which is the energy that it needs, then that will only be once it is vassalized into the proof of weapons network. So vassalize Europe, vassalize Latin America, vassalize Germany, and then provide it with the energy so that you can turn the country into artificial intelligence data centers once you create the migration crisis. And everything that Trump said, gaslighting, was to prop up the dollar. These immigration and refugee crises, this sheer lack of respect for human life and dignity, is the dollar. And then they're blaming it on everything else. This is why that whole room is full of people that are excited that they may be able to actually take away this demonic century or this post Bretton Woods world order and finally be able to utilize their resources in a multipolar world. That's why people are excited that Trump's in power, not because he's going to make America great again, but April the 2nd was going to liberate the world from the death destruction that has been created by this debt-based Ponzi scheme of the Federal Reserve after implementing it on the Bank of England on England. And ironically, Tommy Robinson and all these Elon Musks that pretend they care about things, Keir Starmer suddenly comes out with the digital ID and the beta test and everything that we're actually seeing to do the integration. And now you know what Iran is. Is it really about nuclear weapons or is it about nuclear energy? Because it was always about British petroleum. It was always about not allowing a country to use their resources. But now they can partner with China, and the world's bully to prop up the dollar can no longer do the same techniques. So what do we need to start talking about? Well, Trump's reading the script and got the memo that, we really want UK to do well. We want UK to start exploring the North Sea. Maybe Denmark, we can start looking at Greenland. And so it's going to be war on Europe to make up for military, go through the same cycle, financial industrial complex, followed by vassalization, followed by technical industrial complex. This is proof of weapons network, cannibalizing the West for its own profit to prop up for as long as it can. That's why you have to really consider, where do you want to live while this is happening? And how do you free yourself? Because I don't think there are enough people that can see what's happening, which is why every single day people are distracted with the latest crazy shit that they're flooding our feeds with right now in order to make mentally ill people, people that aren't strong, with low birth rates, which is why they're going to the global south in the first place, because people in the West ain't having children, mentally ill, drug addicted, homeless, police ain't working for them, presidents ain't working for them, prime ministers ain't working for them, and they're just gaslighting and lying and lying and lying. And there's just this one Trump left that people think are kind of different. Most people have caught on, obviously, if you're a Bitcoin Hard Talk listener, but they think he's taking on the system. I just hope that you're going to make yourself great again, because they don't give a shit about you. This is about energy, and they know who the enemy is. Trump knows who the enemy is. The enemy is the American people, the European people, and they're putting together their plans for what they're going to do for that. Okay, let's find the next part.
Disaster and the fake energy catastrophe before it's too late. The carbon footprint is a hoax. made up by people with evil intentions, and they're heading down a path of total destruction. You know, the carbon footprint was a big, big thing a few years ago. I remember hearing about the carbon footprint, and then President Obama would get into Air Force One, a massive Boeing 747, and not a new one, an old one with old engines that spew everything into the atmosphere. He'd talk about the carbon footprint, we must do so. Then he'd get in and he'd fly from Washington to Hawaii to play a round of golf. And then he'd get back onto that big, beautiful plane and he'd fly back and he'd talk about, again, global warming and the carbon footprint. It's a con job. At extreme cost and expense, Europe reduced its own carbon footprint by 37%. Think of that. Congratulations, Europe. Great job. You cost yourself a lot of jobs, a lot of factories closed, but you reduced the carbon footprint by 37%. However, for all of that sacrifice and much more, it's been totally wiped out and then some by a global increase of 54%. Much of it coming from China and other countries that are thriving around China, which now produces more CO2 than all the other developed nations in the world. So all of these countries are working so hard on the carbon footprint, which is nonsense, by the way. It's nonsense. You know, it's interesting. In the United States, we have still radicalized environmentalists, and they want the factories to stop. Everything should stop. No more cows. We don't want cows anymore. I guess they want to kill all the cows. They want to do things that are just unbelievable, and you have it too. But you know, we have a border, strong, and we have a shape, and that shape doesn't just go straight up. That shape is amorphous when it comes to the atmosphere. And if we had the most clean air, and I think we do, we have very clean air. We have the cleanest air we've had in many, many years. But the problem is that other countries, like China, which has air that's a little bit rough, it blows. And no matter what you're doing down here, the air up here tends to get very dirty because it comes in from other countries where their air isn't so clean. And the environmentalists refuse to acknowledge that. Same thing with garbage. In Asia, they dump much of their garbage right into the ocean. And over about a 1 week and 2 week journey, it flows right past Los Angeles. You've seen it. Massive amounts of garbage, almost too much to do anything about, flowing past Los Angeles, past San Francisco, and then somebody will get in trouble because he dropped a cigarette on the beach. The whole thing is crazy. The primary effect of these brutal green energy policies has not been to help the environment, but to redistribute manufacturing and industrial activity from developed countries that follow the insane rules that are put down to polluting countries that break the rules and are making a fortune. They're making a fortune. European electricity bills are now 4 to 5 times more expensive than those in China, and 2 to 3 times higher than the United States. And our bills are coming way down. You probably see that our gasoline prices are way down. You know, we have an expression, drill, baby, drill, and that's what we're doing. We're going to be much lower in a year from now. But they've come way down over the last year. As a result, every air conditioner is like very uncommon to see one in some of these countries because the electric costs are so high. So while the U.S. has approximately 1,300 heat-related deaths annually, that's a lot, Europe loses more than 175,000 people to heat deaths each year because the costs are so expensive you can't turn on an air conditioner. What is that all about? That's not Europe. That's not the Europe that I love and know. All in the name of pretending to stop the global warming hoax. The entire globalist concept of asking successful industrialized nations to inflict pain on themselves and radically disrupt their entire societies must be rejected completely and totally, and it must be immediate. That's why in America I withdrew from the fake Paris Climate Accord, where, by the way, America was paying so much more than every country. Others weren't paying. China didn't have to pay until 2030. Russia was given an old standard that was easy to meet.
I think we get. Yeah, I think we get the point now. Okay. So, this goes on a little bit, and then it ends with the token inspirational cartoon version of America fleeing, from religious persecution in order to save the world and forget about all the oil that was stolen, all the settler colonialism, all the genocides. You get the cartoon version of the heroes and the cowboys and the Indians and the story that needs to be told. That led to this where it is right now, and he needs you to continue to believe in that cartoon, while the rest of the world is looking forward to the end of this dollar era, and the dollar is correcting. There is a very, very rough transition that we're all going through, and everybody is experiencing it. And we have to somehow collectively get through this together. And so I just wanted to leave you at least with a few things that the sooner you can start preparing. And even if you completely disagree with me and it turns out that Trump is the hero, and by the way, if he is, I'll tell you. If I'm wrong about everything, I'll tell you. But if you prepare, you're going to be in a much, much better position. I don't think I am wrong. I care about being accurate. And if I'm wrong, I'll admit it. I've got things wrong before in the past. But I think I'm right here because I'm following the monetary flows, and people have been decapacitated in their ability to analyze because of sheer propaganda and dumbing down operations so that people just can't even see reality and truth. And that is on full force right now. Many people are victims of this system, even the people in the wrong side of the K-shaped economy that have been ignoring what has been happening to the rest of the world, thinking, no, we're the civilized ones. That only happens to the others. Well, it's now being done on yourself. And we can see that. We can see this decline. And Trump wants to say that this is something that Europe's doing when he knows full well this is systemically how the dollar was created, what the proof of weapons network is. And he is continuing the fiscal dominant strategy, which is propping up the debt-based Ponzi scheme, where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, perpetuating the K-shaped economy and vassalizing for his overlords in the financial industrial complex factions of the proof of weapons network, while they weaponize their military industrial complex so they can structure different types of technology for surveillance through the technical industrial complex. And we know that that's happening. And Trump is just simply a cog in the wheel. And this isn't about Trump. Replace Trump with someone else. He just happens to have the narrative that was needed in order to dress up Liberation Day from the dollar and tariff policy as MAGA. Taxing people through these tariffs, which is the American business, selling off assets through foreign direct investment, making small to medium-sized business bankrupt at the large globalist, let's call them, he used that word, globalist institutions, investing with foreign countries in a multipolar world order, requiring a Nobel Peace Prize, while this mafia network continues to create all of this death and destruction, so that he can rebuild and get a real estate transaction and set up his family through Bitcoin, which is short the dollar, long Bitcoin, while he ushers in a surveillance state for the technical industrial complex. And this is what you call draining the swamp. This is what you call creating and accentuating the swamp, tokenizing, securitizing, and financializing it, and pushing more and more people into the swamp and pretending that we are doing something else. And as I said, the history books will be written and they will be rewritten in the correct way because everyone's been so scared of this dollar scheme and everything that comes with it of this economic hitmen and financial weapons and mass destruction that is now cannibalizing itself right now. So what do? Well, you have to decide what your exit is. And your exit involves deciding where the real growth is, deciding where you're going to live. Are you going to stay and fight? Are you going to embrace the technology, or are you going to be dealing in the decentralized technology? Are you going to be making the network more powerful? Are you going to be owning Bitcoin in self-custody, or are you going to be owning it via an ETF? Are you going to be weaponizing and using the dollar debt-based Ponzi scheme by rolling over your debt more? Are you going to be paying off your debt? Are you going to be defaulting in your debt? Now is the time to make these decisions, because I personally believe this is accelerating. And these things take time. And you need to make your decisions. And again, if I'm completely wrong, I'm completely wrong. But at least if you took this seriously, you prepared for this world. So personally, I started preparing 10 years ago because I could see where UK was going. I decided that I would leave my country and invest in decentralized technology and accumulate wealth in a currency that has a fixed supply that I can own in self-custody and spend as I choose. And so my message to you is understand who the enemy is. You have to start with the black pill, which most people don't want to go down, because I denied this for a long time, but now it's becoming obvious and clear. You have to de-radicalize yourself from what you've been taught and the lies you've been taught. And sadly, we enter into this environment where the fabric of society, trust, is breaking down. But there are some orange pills. There are things that we can do. And that's what people need to decide, because we are entering into, I believe, an economy where you're either going to be on a universal basic income doing exactly what they prepared for you, with your mind weak, with the ability to not act, with your business disrupted by artificial intelligence, or you're going to be utilizing the technology, trying to be more productive, saving in hard assets, and exiting the system and preparing for whatever comes next. And so those are my tips for you. In an environment of fiscal dominance, you are in a K-shaped economy. You cannot change that. There is no stopping this train. If you said that Trump was going to pay down the debt and he was going to do something different, no, he's not. The rich are going to get richer, the poor are going to get poorer. The only people that survive are those that have the right assets. The best assets, I believe, are neutral. The central banks are buying gold like crazy. Why are they buying gold? Because it has a fixed supply and it's neutral. What are the others doing? People are buying Bitcoin. The price is being manipulated because BlackRock wants as much as your Bitcoin in an ETF as possible. And Wall Street is building a financial industrial complex around persuading you to put your Bitcoin with them, even tax incentives to do it. You're going to have a digital ID in the UK from now in order to work. Who's going to benefit from that? Are the freelancers, the contractors, the ones that work for offshore companies? How long till they have to have a digital ID? How do you get paid? Are you saving your money in their stable coin? Are you saving your money in their central bank digital currency? Do you hold it at a bank? Are you levered up in debt? These are decisions you need to make. Are you saving it in Bitcoin that exists outside the system? What about gold? So we have these fixed supply neutral assets, gold and Bitcoin. One is digital, one is physical. And what are most people doing? They're wrapping it up in a shitcoin called a stock and giving it to BlackRock to manage for them and hold it in custody for them. Or they buy a shitcoin stock that's going to hold some Bitcoin and then borrow against it as collateral like Elon Musk in the proof of weapons network so you can get a fiat currency loan. These are the decisions that you need to make. So firstly, you've got to understand what's happening. I created a 5-part blog for free called Mind Control, Mind Wars, something like that. Go through it. Understand what this system has as the end game. Even if they don't win, at least you know what a faction of power, which is the proof of weapons network that owns the collective West, what types of things they discuss in board meetings to manage their portfolio. Look at the beta tests. I go through 5 different blogs. You can go that. And at the end of it, gave a completely free course, no agenda, with the best people that I know in the Bitcoin space on how to self-custody. I don't care. You go buy your Bitcoin wherever you need to buy it. There is no agenda other than you start owning more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, learn how to self-custody so that you can actually go wherever you need to go. If you need to change, the money comes with you. You're not stuck in that system. They may start implementing exit tax, getting more oppressive, whatever they're going to do, but they want you to own it with them. In the extremes, they confiscated those assets in custody. Which jurisdiction are you going to live? What is the growth? Who's going to benefit and who's going to decline? You know, what type of narrative? What is Trump doing with his money? Clearly, investing globally, investing in AI, investing in Bitcoin, and launching stablecoin to weaponize debt to get more money across the family. What does that mean? Where's he building the Trump towers? Are they being built in America or are they being built in the Middle East? Where's the money coming from? Is it coming from China or is it coming from America? You know, all questions to ask. And what I do is I go live every single week on Bitcoin Hard Talk to cover this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics. I'll follow the money and I'll help you prepare for a world of Bitcoin, AI, and CBDCs. I was blessed. I didn't take any Silicon Valley money for our business, so our business was liberated. We had Bitcoin on our balance sheet, so we didn't need any funding. We never needed to turn our business into a shitcoin and launch an IPO on the American market, so I'm not vassalized into the proof of weapons network agenda. I managed to hold Bitcoin in self-custody personally, and you know, hedge enough positions for any circumstance and use gold as an alternative mechanism as well. Share this journey. I'm willing to experience with you for as long as my voice goes on for. And I'll give you everything because I don't have an agenda other than the world will be shit if only a few people end up on the right side of where I think they'd like to take us. And I want a community of as many people as possible. Do I need to use X? Am I building my social credit score? Yes, I do. Will there be consequences to it? Yes, there will, but I need to be productive. We can't get this right. We can't get this perfect. But here's some things that I think people should be doing. Firstly, boycott the Federal Reserve. Boycott the proof. That is, the dollar is the mechanism that is greasing this agenda that is destroying so many people in the world. And if you boycott the Federal Reserve, you need money outside the system with your savings. You need some spending money. I have money in a bank as spending money. Treat your spending money and your savings differently. If you save with money in a bank, you know, you're going to be getting on the worst, on the other side of this network. You're going to be getting poorer. Your wages aren't going to increase at the same rate that they're inflating away your savings. And you're holding it in custody and they're benefiting from your balance. So boycott the Federal Reserve, own Bitcoin, own gold. Boycott BlackRock by not holding it via an ETF, hold it in self-custody. Learn how to self-custody. Artificial intelligence, self-custody, digital ID. These digital ID can be controlled by you. We've already gone through the process of hosting Bitcoin on the world's largest distributed supercomputer, having attack vectors, having nodes, various other things. These are terms you need to familiarize yourself with. You can't make BlackRock more powerful if you want the freedom that comes from this. Don't listen to Howard Lutnick and Cantor Fitzgerald and Strike and Jack Mallers who are asking you to borrow against your Bitcoin so that they can put it into the coffers of these securitized and financialized companies in the proof of weapons network. So they can give you some fiat currency by holding your Bitcoin for you. So don't borrow fiat currency against your Bitcoin unless you're going to be doing that as part of a managed process. But boycott the banks. They want to create digital currency every time they issue a loan, and they're going to be creating stable coins. I understand you need to do it for your spending money. We need to be sensible here. It's not perfect. But where are you directionally headed towards? Own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. Learn how to self-custody. Don't borrow against it unless it's part of a different type of plan. What are you going to do with your debt? What are you investing in? Are you investing in the companies that are creating Palantir and enslaving people, or are you boycotting them? Who are you spending your money with? Are you buying everything that you need to through Amazon? Sometimes we have to, but could you spend it local? Could you do it? Are you supporting your local community? Don't you want money flowing in your local community? And what is your local community? Is it a place on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network or the right side? What are you going to do? Are you going to wait, or are you going to stay and fight? That's a decision you have to make, not easy decisions. But if you leave it to them, you're not making the decision, they're making the decision for you. And the vast majority won't make these decisions, won't be prepared, won't be watching Bitcoin Hard Talk. They're going to be on a universal basic income with a deflation, with a depleting currency in a surveillance state, wondering how they're going to escape. So these decisions need to be made. And some people, that would be right for them. They've opted out. They've been psyoped so much that they are mentally demoralized. They can't even have a family. They hate women. They hate men. They're doing all sorts of crazy things. Drug addictions, pornography addictions, all sorts of stuff. These were psyops that were inflicted upon us. And you think this country's great? You think this cares about us? You're a victim of that if you're in any of that stuff. And we all have our own conversations. We're all going to meet our maker. Are we here to serve humanity? Are we fighting oppression? Are we ignoring it? If we're ignoring it, what is the consequence to ignoring it? What are we on earth for to do anyway? Are we in this together? Or are we going to fall for, it's the Muslim invasion, the Jews rule the world, it's the radical left, it's the right? Are we going to be a part of the problem, or are we going to be a part of the solution? Are we going to fall for the psyop? I know personally, it's having its effect on me. I'm definitely not perfect. I'm getting more angry. I'm getting more radicalized after seeing death and destruction from this genocide. I'm getting angry. But what are we here for? Who are we accountable to? There has to be a higher purpose. We were created, and I'm accountable to that creator. And some people don't believe that. You have your beliefs, but what if we can't agree on what wrong and right is and what morality is? What chance have we got? All right, there is no truth. If there is no truth, then what the hell are we going to be doing? There has to be a truth. There is a truth. What's wrong? What's right? Do we serve humanity? Do we fight oppression? Or are we just a cog in a wall plodding along? No. And so I don't have all the answers, but I do know that Bitcoin is a fixed supply, gold is a semi-fixed supply. And when you need to manage your transition, it's going to be pretty hard running around on a flight with a bunch of gold. You may be able to hit someone over the head and protect yourself with that gold. But Bitcoin allows you to own your own money, spend your own money, and the monetary policy cannot be changed. But they want your Bitcoin. So own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. Self-custody it and spend it in the right way, because your real vote is your money. It's not your vote. They don't need your vote. The lobby care about your money. That's the real vote. And when the proof of weapons network is in charge, they care about their stock price. They care about reputation that impacts profits and bottom line. Boycott, divest, sanction. We're already seeing that the network can cannibalize on itself. Israel is going to be a vassal state for the GCC power structure because they played the game at the sovereign level differently. So these changes will happen. In a multipolar world, there will be a world where there are competing interests. Let's bring back competition. You know, trade, hard money, competition. Let's add ethics. What's right, what's wrong? You know, these different types of things. You pick what is your ethical standard. And I'll share the journey with you. For as long as I can talk, I'll go live on Bitcoin Hard Talk. We're going to be back next week for episode 100. Here's what I'd like you to do. Go over to simondixon.com, join my newsletter. I'll email you every week to try and share this journey together and make sure you're on top of the information curve. If you'd like a free course on how to self-custody, then head over to simondixon.com, hit that yellow button on the page, and you can sign up for the free Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. If you would like to break this down every time I go live each week, and then subscribe to me on YouTube, hit the bell symbol, hit all, and share this with as many people as possible. In case I get shut down, follow me on Spotify. If we get censored, I'll go over there. We've got a following that we're building up over there. Go into Rumble, sorry, not Spotify. Go into Rumble, put Simon Dixon, so follow me over there, and you'll get a notification. If you prefer podcasts, don't say this is too long, I won't watch it. Download it, chunk it down, watch it throughout the week. Do it while you're working out, do it while you're driving. Do two things at once. Become productive, learn how you're doing, and listen to something in the background. You can put it on Spotify. You can put it on Apple. And yes, I recognize these are all nodes of the Proof of Weapons network, but I need to get this message out to as many people as possible. But just in case, I have my own website, and I'll also try to get as many of the decentralized solutions that everyone's nagging me. And I will make sure that we share that journey together and keep nagging me. Put in the comment section different things you can do. You know, eventually we're going to have to transition to those decentralized systems. Right now, in order to get the message out effectively to as many people, is centralized. But we've proven that money you can own, money you can spend that exists on a decentralized network, Bitcoin, is something that we could probably do with ID, artificial intelligence, various other things. Use uncensored artificial intelligence. Run an LLM model. These are different things we're going to have to do. I don't want to overwhelm you. So let's just relax, join the journey, do it every week, but let's do it together. And let's make small progress towards it, but treat it with urgency. Do not believe that they give a shit about you and that this system is some happy, clappy, positive thing. If you live in the West, the monetary flows that I presented means the West is cannibalizing itself, and they are lying to you about everything so that you're not prepared, so that they can own your Bitcoin, they can own your gold, they can have you as a debt slave, and they can make sure you're on that universal basic income with their technology. We could progress towards that, because as dark and as black-pilled as this was, there is an orange pill. So always remember, once you know the truth, then you can get to peace. And that was a psyop saying you don't know the truth anyway. Look inside your heart. Think what the truth is. Spend time reading, asking the questions. How did we get here? Who was our creator? And what am I going to answer to them? And what have been the psyops? How has it served me up until now? Always remember, you're alive at one of the most interesting and exciting time in financial history if you understand. I want to make sure you're on the right side of that change. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do really well. I want to make sure you're one of those people that is a source of inspiration for the 99% that are going to get completely on the wrong side of this. That's just a fact and reality. I don't know how to get this message out to as many people as possible. I know I need your help. So if you'd like to if you'd like to share the algorithm, if you'd like to subscribe, if you'd like to put comments, that all helps. And the Proof of Weapons Network may not want my message to get to you, or they may want to use it for my social credit score. I don't know anymore. I'm just going to do what I continue to do. And I want to do it with peace, love, and unity to the best of my ability, with language and with information. And I'll keep trying to use tools to try and get that information out to as many people as possible, if you're willing to help me and share me with me on this journey. So I will see you this time next week. That was episode 99 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, where we discussed the United Nations meeting, what I believe to be marking the end of the dollar era and a movement towards multipolarity, which I think will be good for more people, because competition was meant to be a Western value, and this global hegemon shit is killing too many people, and it is moving to a transition, and they are lying to you. So let's try and do it in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 100 with peace. Peace.